The transformation of humanity's relationship with the divine represents one of the most profound ideological reversals in galactic history. To understand the imperial cult's emergence, one must first grasp the radical secular philosophy that preceded it and the cataclysmic events that shattered those foundations forever. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind championed what became known as the Imperial Truth, a comprehensive worldview that positioned reason, science, and empirical knowledge as humanity's salvation. This philosophy emerged from the ashes of Old Night, when humanity had endured millennia of technological regression, psychic predation, and the collapse of interstellar civilization. The emperor observed how superstition and religious fervor had contributed to humanity's downfall, noting how demon cults and warp-touched prophets had exploited mankind's spiritual yearnings to devastating effect. The imperial truth declared that no gods existed, neither the chaos powers nor any benevolent deities. What primitive cultures interpreted as divine intervention were merely manifestations of psychic phenomena, alien manipulation, or natural forces beyond their comprehension. The emperor positioned himself not as a divine being, but as the pinnacle of human evolution and scientific achievement. His extraordinary abilities stemmed from advanced psychic development and ancient knowledge, not divine nature. This distinction proved crucial to the imperial truth's framework, as it maintained that even the emperor's seemingly miraculous powers could be understood through rational investigation. Throughout the Great Crusade, the imperial truth served multiple strategic purposes beyond mere ideology. By dismantling local religions and replacing them with secular imperial governance, the emperor sought to starve the chaos gods of worship and belief, emotions and devotions that fed their power in the warp. The truth also provided a unifying framework for the countless human worlds brought into imperial compliance, replacing diverse religious traditions with a single, rational worldview centered on human achievement and technological progress. The Space Marine legions became the primary instruments of this ideological transformation. As they conquered world after world, they systematically destroyed temples, executed priests, and burned religious texts. The Word-Bearers Legion, ironically, proved particularly zealous in this task during their early years, razing entire cities dedicated to local deities and replacing them with monuments to human achievement. The emperor's sons, the Primarchs, largely embraced this secular vision, though some harbored private doubts about completely dismissing the spiritual aspects of human nature. Imperial institutions reflected this philosophical foundation at every level. The nascent Adeptus Mechanicus maintained their own relationship with the Omnissiah, but even this represented a form of technological mysticism rather than traditional religious worship. The Imperial army fought under banners bearing the Imperial eagle and lightning bolt, symbols of human authority rather than divine protection. Education systems across compliant worlds emphasized scientific method, rational thought, and loyalty to the Imperial hierarchy as extensions of human excellence rather than divine mandate. The Emperor's rejection of worship extended to his personal conduct. When populations on newly compliant worlds attempted to venerate him as a god, he consistently redirected such devotion toward the broader Imperial project and human achievement. His public appearances emphasized his role as humanity's guide and protector rather than an object of worship. Even his closest advisors, including Malkador the Sigillite, understood that the Emperor viewed his extraordinary nature as the product of ancient human psychic development rather than divine ascension. This secular foundation began showing cracks even before the Horus heresy erupted. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra to work on the Webway project left the Great Crusade's ideological enforcement to his sons and subordinates, many of whom lacked his absolute conviction in the Imperial truth. Some Primarchs, particularly Lorgar of the Word-Bearers, struggled with the spiritual void left by the truth's rejection of all transcendent meaning. The discovery of chaos during the later stages of the Crusade revealed that the warp did indeed contain entities that resembled gods in their power and influence, challenging the truth's fundamental assertions about the nature of reality. The Horus heresy shattered the Imperial truth's credibility in ways that would prove irreversible. When half the Space Marine legions turned against the Emperor, they did so not through rational disagreement with Imperial policy, but through corruption by the very entities the Imperial truth claimed did not exist. The Chaos Gods proved their reality through their servants' actions, demonstrating powers that transcended any rational explanation the Imperial truth could provide. Demons manifested on battlefields across the galaxy, wielding abilities that defied scientific understanding and corrupting loyal Imperial forces through means that purely secular philosophy could not address. The Emperor's confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's battle barge represented the Imperial truth's final, catastrophic failure. The being who had insisted he was not a god faced his most beloved son, now transformed into a vessel for powers that claimed divine status. The battle's outcome, the Emperor's mortal wounding and subsequent internment upon the Golden Throne, created a crisis that the Imperial truth could not survive. The galaxy's greatest advocate for secular rationalism now existed in a state that resembled death more than life, sustained by arcane technologies and psychic energies that bordered on the miraculous. The Golden Throne itself became the focal point for this ideological transformation. Originally designed as part of the Emperor's Webway project, it now served as a life support system of impossible complexity, keeping the Emperor's consciousness active while his physical form remained on the threshold between life and death. The throne required daily sacrifices of psychers to maintain its function, creating a ritual that resembled religious sacrifice more than technological maintenance. Imperial citizens witnessing these procedures could hardly reconcile them with the purely rational worldview the Imperial truth had promoted. The Emperor's condition on the Golden Throne defied every principle the Imperial truth had established. His continued existence suggested powers beyond mortal comprehension, while his apparent guidance of Imperial forces through psychic manifestation resembled divine intervention more than scientific phenomenon. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that enabled warp travel throughout the Imperium, emanated from the Emperor's location on Terra, creating a practical dependence on what increasingly appeared to be a supernatural force. In the immediate aftermath of the heresy, Imperial leadership faced an unprecedented crisis of meaning. The secular philosophy that had unified humanity during the Great Crusade lay in ruins, discredited by events that revealed the existence of genuine supernatural threats. The population needed explanations for the catastrophe that had befallen the Imperium, and the Imperial truth offered no framework for understanding corruption by entities it claimed did not exist. Into this ideological vacuum stepped figures like Tyrik-Kage, whose experiences during the Horus heresy had convinced her of the Emperor's divine nature. Kage had witnessed events that transcended rational explanation, miraculous healings, prophetic visions, and manifestations of power that could only be described as divine intervention. Her transformation from a simple remembrancer into the first recognized Imperial saint established a template for the theological revolution that would follow. Kage's teachings represented a radical departure from the Imperial truth while maintaining continuity with Imperial loyalty. She proclaimed that the Emperor had always possessed divine nature, but had concealed this truth during the Great Crusade for strategic reasons. According to her interpretation, the Emperor's rejection of worship had been necessary to prevent premature revelation of his godhood, which would have attracted the Chaos Gods' attention before humanity was ready to resist them. The Horus heresy, in this view, represented the Emperor's willing sacrifice of his mortal form to achieve true divinity and eternal guardianship over humanity. This theological framework provided answers the Imperial truth could not offer. The Emperor's survival on the Golden Throne became evidence of his divine nature rather than an unexplainable anomaly. His continued protection of humanity through the Astronomicon demonstrated active, divine intervention on behalf of his chosen people. The existence of Chaos Gods became proof that divine powers were real, making the Emperor's own divinity not only possible but necessary for humanity's survival. The early Imperial saints who followed Kage's example established many of the theological foundations that would define the Imperial cult. These individuals, often survivors of the Horus heresy who had witnessed seemingly miraculous events, provided testimony that the emperor's power transcended mortal limitations. Their accounts of divine visions, miraculous healings, and supernatural protection created a growing body of evidence that challenged the imperial truth's materialist assumptions. The transformation from imperial truth to imperial cult occurred gradually rather than through official decree. No single moment marked the formal abandonment of secular philosophy in favor of religious devotion. Instead, practical necessity drove the change as imperial institutions struggled to maintain order and meaning in a galaxy that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more dangerous than the imperial truth had acknowledged. The emperor's continued existence on the Golden Throne provided a focal point for this transformation, offering a bridge between the secular leader of the Great Crusade and the divine protector humanity desperately needed. The emerging imperial cult retained many elements of the imperial truth while fundamentally altering their interpretation. Human achievement remained important, but now as expressions of divine favor rather than purely secular accomplishment. The emperor's role as humanity's guide continued, but transformed from scientific leadership to divine revelation. The rejection of alien influence persisted, but now carried religious rather than merely practical justification. This theological evolution created new institutions and practices that would define imperial society for millennia to come. Prayer replaced purely rational discourse in many contexts, while ritual observance supplemented administrative procedure. The emperor's image, once a symbol of human authority, became an object of veneration and spiritual focus. Imperial citizens who had once viewed themselves as participants in a great secular project now saw themselves as the chosen people of a divine protector. The practical implications of this transformation extended far beyond mere belief. Imperial military forces began invoking the emperor's protection before battle, while imperial governors sought divine guidance in their decisions. The Psyker sacrifices that maintained the Golden Throne acquired religious significance as sacred offerings to sustain the god emperor's protection. Imperial citizens found comfort in prayer and ritual observance that the stark rationalism of the imperial truth had never provided. The emerging cult also provided new frameworks for understanding the ongoing threats facing humanity. Chaos corruption became not merely a form of alien influence, but spiritual contamination that required divine protection to resist. Xeno's threats transformed from simple military challenges into tests of faith and devotion. The constant warfare that defined imperial existence gained religious meaning as humanity's sacred struggle against forces that sought to corrupt or destroy the emperor's chosen people. The transformation from scattered religious movements to an organized ecclesiastical hierarchy required centuries of political maneuvering, theological consolidation, and institutional development. While the early imperial cult emerged organically from the spiritual void left by the imperial truth's collapse, its evolution into the Adeptus Ministorum represented a deliberate effort to harness religious fervor for imperial governance and control. The nascent religious movements that sprouted across the Imperium during the early 31st millennium lacked central coordination or unified doctrine. Individual worlds developed their own interpretations of the emperor's divinity, often incorporating local traditions and customs that predated imperial compliance. On Ophelia 7, former shrine maidens adapted ancient fertility rituals to venerate the emperor as a life-giving force. The industrial world of Lucius Prime developed mechanical liturgies that praised the god emperor's mastery over technology and production. These diverse expressions of faith created a patchwork of beliefs that shared common reverence for the emperor while differing dramatically in practice and interpretation. The lack of doctrinal unity posed significant challenges for imperial governance. Local religious leaders often wielded considerable influence over planetary populations, sometimes rivaling or even superseding the authority of imperial governors. On several worlds, competing interpretations of the emperors led to sectarian conflicts that disrupted production quotas and military recruitment. The High Lords of Terra recognized that religious enthusiasm, while potentially valuable for maintaining loyalty and morale, required institutional structure to prevent it from becoming a source of instability. The first attempts at religious organization emerged from existing imperial bureaucracies rather than grassroots religious movements. The Adeptus Administratum, responsible for managing the Imperium's vast governmental apparatus, began documenting and cataloging various religious practices across imperial worlds. Administrative scribes compiled reports on local customs, identifying common elements that could serve as foundations for standardized religious observance. These early surveys revealed the extent of theological diversity while highlighting the universal reverence for the emperor that transcended local variations. Sebastian Thor's rise to prominence during the Age of Apostasy marked the crucial transition from informal religious movements to organized ecclesiastical authority. Thor, originally a simple preacher from the Dimammer system, possessed an extraordinary ability to synthesize diverse theological traditions into coherent doctrine while maintaining the passionate devotion that characterized early imperial worship. His preaching drew massive crowds across multiple star systems as he articulated a vision of imperial faith that resonated with believers from vastly different cultural backgrounds. Thor's theological innovations addressed many of the practical problems that had plagued early religious movements. He established standardized prayers and rituals that could be adapted to local customs without losing their essential meaning. His interpretation of imperial doctrine emphasized the emperor's role as humanity's protector and guide, while acknowledging the diverse ways different cultures might express their devotion. Most importantly, Thor articulated a clear hierarchical structure for religious authority that paralleled existing imperial governmental systems. The conflict with Goge Vander provided the catalyst for formalizing religious authority within imperial institutions. Vandar's dual control of both the Adeptus Administratum and the emerging religious hierarchy demonstrated the dangers of unchecked ecclesiastical power. His reign of terror, marked by brutal suppression of dissent and increasingly erratic religious decrees, convinced the High Lords that religious authority required institutional constraints similar to those governing other imperial organizations. Thor's successful rebellion against Vander established precedents that would define the Adeptus Ministorum's relationship with other imperial institutions. The Confederation of Light, Thor's coalition of religious and military forces, demonstrated how properly channeled religious fervor could serve imperial interests while maintaining appropriate checks on ecclesiastical authority. The alliance between Thor's religious movement and elements of the Adeptus Custodes and Imperial Navy proved that the emerging church could work within existing imperial power structures rather than attempting to supersede them. The formal establishment of the Adeptus Ministorum occurred through a series of High Lords' decrees that codified religious authority within imperial law. These foundational documents define the Church's jurisdiction over matters of faith and worship, while explicitly limiting its involvement in secular governance. The new organization received authority to standardize religious doctrine, train and ordain clergy, and maintain places of worship throughout the Imperium. However, it was forbidden from maintaining military forces beyond ceremonial guards and personal protection details. The position of ecclesiarch emerged as the supreme religious authority within the Imperium, ranking among the High Lords of Terra and wielding influence comparable to other major imperial institutions. The first ecclesiarchs faced the monumental task of transforming diverse local religious movements into a unified church capable of serving the Imperium's spiritual needs. This process required delicate negotiations with planetary governors, existing religious leaders, and various imperial organizations that had developed their own relationships with emerging religious movements. The establishment of the Holy Synod on Terra provided the institutional framework for managing the Adeptus Ministorum's vast responsibilities. This governing body, composed of senior clerics from across the Imperium, met regularly to debate theological questions, establish doctrinal standards, and coordinate religious activities on a galactic scale. The Synod's location on Terra, within sight of the Imperial Palace and the Golden Throne, symbolized the Church's central role in imperial society while maintaining appropriate deference to secular authority. The Holy Synod's early sessions focused primarily on doctrinal standardization and administrative organization. Senior clerics debated fundamental questions about the nature of the emperor's divinity, the proper forms of worship, and the relationship between faith and imperial law. These theological discussions often reflected practical concerns about maintaining unity across diverse imperial worlds while accommodating local customs and traditions. The Synod developed compromise positions that preserved essential doctrinal elements while allowing flexibility in implementation. The integration of the imperial cult into broader imperial governmental structures required careful negotiation with existing institutions. The Adeptus Administratum initially viewed the emerging church with suspicion, concerned that religious authority might interfere with efficient bureaucratic administration. However, practical experience demonstrated that religious motivation could enhance administrative efficiency by providing moral framework for civil service and encouraging voluntary compliance with imperial regulations. The relationship between the ecclesiarchy and the Adeptus Administratum evolved into a complex partnership that leveraged the strengths of both institutions. Religious ceremonies marking important administrative events, such as the beginning of new tax cycles or the inauguration of planetary governors, provided opportunities for the Church to reinforce civic duty while allowing administrators to benefit from religious authority. Joint training programs for senior administrators and clerics ensured mutual understanding and cooperation between the two organizations. The Adeptus Ministorum's relationship with the Inquisition proved more complex and occasionally contentious. Both organizations claimed authority over matters involving faith and heresy, leading to jurisdictional disputes that required careful resolution. The Inquisition's mandate to investigate and eliminate threats to imperial security sometimes conflicted with the ecclesiarchy's pastoral responsibilities toward imperial citizens. Early conflicts arose when inquisitors attempted to investigate popular religious movements that the Church considered orthodox expressions of faith. The resolution of these jurisdictional issues established protocols that would govern Inquisition-ecclesiarchy relations for millennia. The Church retained primary authority over doctrinal matters and routine religious observance, while the Inquisition maintained responsibility for investigating suspected heresy and corruption. Joint operations became common when dealing with complex cases involving both religious and security concerns. Senior ecclesiarchy officials received training in recognizing signs of corruption, while inquisitors developed better understanding of orthodox religious practices. The Adeptus Astartes presented unique challenges for the emerging church hierarchy. The Space Marine chapters maintained their own traditions and beliefs that often predated the formal establishment of the imperial cult. Many chapters had developed their own interpretations of the emperor's nature and their role as his chosen warriors. The ecclesiarchy faced the delicate task of acknowledging these traditions while encouraging conformity with broader imperial religious practices. The solution involved recognizing the Adeptus Astartes as a special category within imperial religious life. Space Marines were acknowledged as having a unique relationship with the emperor that transcended normal religious observance. Their chapter traditions received official recognition as legitimate expressions of imperial faith, provided they remained consistent with core doctrinal principles. This arrangement allowed the Church to maintain theological authority while respecting the autonomy that Space Marine chapters required for effective military operations. The ecclesiarchy's expansion beyond Terra required the development of extensive organizational structures capable of managing religious affairs across thousands of worlds. Cardinal worlds emerged as regional centers of ecclesiastical authority, each overseeing religious activities within designated sectors of imperial space. These worlds typically featured massive cathedral complexes that served as administrative centers, training facilities for clergy, and pilgrimage destinations for the faithful. The selection of cardinal worlds reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Ophelia 7 became one of the first cardinal worlds due to its existing religious infrastructure and strategic location within a densely populated sector. The world's transformation from a minor imperial outpost into a major religious center demonstrated the church's growing influence and provided a model for similar developments elsewhere. Massive construction projects created cathedral complexes capable of accommodating millions of pilgrims, while housing the administrative apparatus necessary for managing sector-wide religious activities. The training and ordination of clergy required standardized educational programs that could produce qualified religious leaders for service throughout the Imperium. The Schola Progenium, originally established to educate the orphans of imperial servants, expanded its curriculum to include theological training for prospective clerics. These institutions developed comprehensive programs covering imperial doctrine, pastoral care, administrative procedures, and basic military training for service in dangerous frontier regions. The ecclesiarchy's missionary activities extended imperial religious influence to newly discovered worlds and regions that had been isolated during the Age of Strife. Missionary fleets carried teams of trained clerics to establish churches, schools, and charitable institutions that would serve as foundations for imperial religious life. These missions often preceded formal imperial compliance efforts, preparing populations for integration into the broader imperial community through religious conversion and education. The development of religious infrastructure required massive resource allocation and coordination with other imperial institutions. Cathedral construction projects rivaled the scale of major military installations, requiring specialized architects, skilled craftsmen, and enormous quantities of materials. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided technical expertise for advanced construction techniques, while the Imperial Navy ensured safe transport of materials and personnel to distant construction sites. The ecclesiarchy's charitable activities became an important aspect of its integration into imperial society. Church-sponsored hospitals, schools, and food distribution centers provided essential services that complemented official imperial welfare programs. These activities enhanced the church's reputation among ordinary imperial citizens while demonstrating the practical benefits of religious devotion. The organization of charitable work also provided training opportunities for junior clergy and created networks of lay volunteers who supported church activities. The establishment of religious festivals and observances created shared cultural experiences that transcended planetary boundaries. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension became the most important religious holiday throughout the Imperium, marked by elaborate ceremonies, charitable activities, and renewed expressions of loyalty to the Golden Throne. Regional variations in celebration allowed local customs to flourish within the framework of imperial religious observance, strengthening both local identity and imperial unity. The Adeptus Ministorum's growing influence attracted both support and opposition from various quarters of imperial society. Noble houses recognized the political advantages of close association with religious authority, leading to generous donations for church construction projects and the establishment of family chapels within noble estates. Merchant guilds appreciated the church's emphasis on honest dealing and fair treatment of workers, finding that religious moral frameworks enhanced business relationships and reduced commercial disputes. Opposition to ecclesiastical expansion came primarily from entrenched interests that viewed religious authority as a threat to existing power structures. Some planetary governors resented the church's growing influence over their populations, particularly when religious leaders questioned policies or practices that conflicted with imperial moral teachings. Military commanders occasionally clashed with clerics over the proper balance between tactical necessity and religious observance during combat operations. The resolution of these institutional conflicts established the foundation for the complex ecclesiastical hierarchy that would govern imperial religious life for the next 10 millennia. The Adeptus Ministorum's organizational structure reflected both practical necessities of managing faith across a million worlds and the theological principles that defined imperial worship. At its apex stood the ecclesiarch, whose authority derived directly from proximity to the Golden Throne and responsibility for interpreting the Emperor's divine will for all humanity. The office of ecclesiarch commanded resources and influence that rivaled the greatest imperial institutions. From the towering spires of the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra, successive ecclesiarchs wielded authority over billions of clerics, controlled vast financial resources generated by tithes and donations, and shaped the spiritual lives of trillions of imperial citizens. The position required individuals capable of balancing theological scholarship with political acumen, as ecclesiarchs regularly negotiated with other high lords while maintaining doctrinal purity across countless diverse worlds. Beneath the ecclesiarch, the rank of cardinal represented the highest operational authority within the church hierarchy. Cardinals typically governed entire sectors or oversaw specialized functions that spanned multiple star systems. Cardinal worlds served as regional headquarters where these senior clerics maintained massive cathedral complexes that functioned as administrative centers, theological seminaries, and pilgrimage destinations. The Cardinal of Ophelia VII controlled religious activities across the Ophelia sector, managing thousands of subordinate clerics while overseeing the spiritual welfare of hundreds of billions of faithful citizens. The selection of cardinals involved complex processes that balanced theological merit, administrative competence, and political considerations. Candidates typically emerged from the ranks of arch-cardinals, who had demonstrated exceptional leadership in managing large ecclesiastical territories or specialized church functions. The Holy Synod reviewed potential appointments, examining candidates' doctrinal orthodoxy, pastoral effectiveness, and ability to work within the broader imperial governmental structure. Final appointments required approval from the ecclesiarch and formal recognition by the High Lords of Terra. Cardinal worlds developed distinctive characteristics that reflected their roles as centers of ecclesiastical authority. These worlds featured massive cathedral cities that could accommodate millions of pilgrims, while housing the extensive bureaucracies necessary for managing sector-wide religious activities. The Cathedral of St. Drusus on Ophelia VII stretched across several kilometers of the planetary surface, its towering spires visible from orbital approach vectors. The structure contained not only vast worship spaces capable of holding hundreds of thousands of faithful, but also administrative offices, residential quarters for senior clerics, libraries containing theological texts from across the Imperium, and workshops where skilled artisans created religious artifacts. Arch-cardinals occupied the tier immediately below cardinals, typically governing subsectors or overseeing specialized church functions within cardinal territories. These positions required individuals capable of managing complex operations across multiple star systems while maintaining direct oversight of local religious activities. The Arch-Cardinal of the Calixis subsector coordinated religious activities across dozens of worlds, ensuring doctrinal consistency while accommodating local variations in worship practices. Arch-Cardinals often specialized in particular aspects of church operations, such as missionary activities, theological education, or the management of shrine worlds. The rank of bishop represented the primary level of planetary religious authority, with most imperial worlds hosting at least one bishop responsible for overseeing local church activities. Bishops managed networks of parishes, monasteries, and shrines that served their world's population while ensuring compliance with broader ecclesiastical directives. On heavily populated hive worlds, multiple bishops might oversee different regions or demographic groups, coordinating their activities through planetary synods that met regularly to address local religious concerns. Bishops faced unique challenges that varied dramatically based on their world's characteristics and population. On agricultural worlds with scattered settlements, bishops relied heavily on circuit riding priests who traveled between communities to provide religious services and maintain doctrinal oversight. Industrial worlds required bishops capable of addressing the spiritual needs of massive worker populations while navigating complex relationships with factory overseers and guild leaders. Frontier worlds presented bishops with the additional challenges of maintaining religious observance in dangerous environments while often serving as the primary imperial authority in regions where formal governmental structures remained underdeveloped. The selection and training of bishops emphasized both theological knowledge and practical leadership skills. Candidates typically emerged from the ranks of senior priests who had demonstrated exceptional pastoral abilities and administrative competence. The Schola Progenium provided advanced theological education for prospective bishops, covering imperial doctrine, canon law, administrative procedures, and diplomatic protocols necessary for working with planetary governors and other imperial officials. Many bishops also received military training to prepare them for service on dangerous frontier worlds or in regions threatened by heretical movements. Confessors represented a specialized category within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, serving as spiritual advisors to imperial military forces, noble houses, and other important institutions. These clerics combined theological training with practical understanding of the environments in which they served. Military confessors accompanied imperial guard regiments and naval fleets, providing spiritual guidance to soldiers while ensuring that military operations remained consistent with imperial moral teachings. Their presence on battlefields often proved crucial for maintaining morale during extended campaigns against heretical or Xenos forces. The role of confessor required individuals capable of adapting their ministry to highly specialized circumstances. Naval confessors serving aboard imperial warships needed to understand the unique challenges of void warfare and extended deployments in the dangerous environment of space. They conducted religious services in cramped ship chapels, provided counseling to crew members struggling with the psychological pressures of void travel, and ensured that ship traditions remained consistent with imperial religious doctrine. During naval battles, confessors often served alongside ship officers on command bridges, offering prayers for victory while providing spiritual support during the intense stress of combat operations. Military confessors attached to Imperial Guard regiments faced different but equally demanding challenges. They accompanied soldiers into combat zones where death remained a constant possibility, providing last rites to the dying while inspiring the living to greater acts of courage and devotion. These clerics learned to conduct abbreviated religious services that could be completed quickly in dangerous environments, developed portable altars that could be rapidly assembled in temporary positions, and mastered the art of delivering inspirational sermons that strengthened soldiers' resolve without compromising operational security. The network of ordinary priests formed the foundation of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, serving in parish churches, shrine complexes, and monastic communities throughout the Imperium. These clerics provided daily religious services for imperial citizens, administered sacraments marking important life events, and served as the primary point of contact between the church and ordinary believers. Parish priests typically served specific geographic areas or demographic groups, developing intimate knowledge of their community's needs and concerns, while maintaining the doctrinal standards established by their ecclesiastical superiors. Missionary priests represented a specialized category dedicated to expanding imperial religious influence into new regions or populations. These clerics received additional training in cultural adaptation, languages, and survival skills necessary for operating in challenging environments. Missionary expeditions often preceded formal imperial compliance efforts, establishing religious foundations that would facilitate subsequent political integration. The work required exceptional dedication, as missionaries frequently operated in isolation from other imperial institutions, while facing potential hostility from populations unfamiliar with imperial religious practices. The establishment of monastic orders provided structured environments for intensive religious study and contemplation, while serving important functions within the broader ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Order of the Sacred Rose maintained extensive libraries on Ophelia 7, where scholar monks preserved and copied theological texts from across the Imperium. These institutions served as repositories of religious knowledge, while training specialists in various aspects of imperial doctrine. Monastic communities also provided retreat facilities, where clerics could engage in intensive spiritual exercises and theological study away from the demands of pastoral duties. Different monastic orders developed specialized focuses that served particular needs within the imperial religious community. The Order of the Argent Shroud dedicated itself to maintaining and protecting important religious sites, providing skilled guardians for shrines and reliquaries throughout the Imperium. The Order of the Ebon Chalice focused on theological scholarship, producing learned commentaries on imperial doctrine, while training advanced theologians for service in senior ecclesiastical positions. The Order of the Fiery Heart specialized in missionary work, preparing clerics for service in dangerous frontier regions, where establishing imperial religious presence required exceptional courage and dedication. Shrine worlds represented the pinnacle of imperial religious achievement, entire planets dedicated primarily to worship and pilgrimage. These worlds featured massive religious complexes that could accommodate millions of visitors while providing comprehensive facilities for religious education, theological study, and spiritual retreat. The shrine world of San Lear housed the preserved remains of Saint Lear, attracting pilgrims from across the Segmentum Solar who sought healing through proximity to the saint's relics. The world's entire economy revolved around supporting religious activities, with local populations engaged in crafting religious artifacts, maintaining shrine facilities, and providing services for visiting pilgrims. The management of shrine worlds required specialized administrative structures that could handle the complex logistics of accommodating massive numbers of pilgrims while maintaining appropriate religious atmosphere. Shrine world governors typically held ecclesiastical rank in addition to their secular authority, ensuring coordination between religious and administrative functions. These worlds maintained their own defense forces, usually drawn from local populations with strong religious motivation, while relying on Imperial Navy patrols to protect pilgrimage routes from pirate attacks or other threats. The network of cathedrals and places of worship throughout Imperial space reflected both the Church's growing influence and the diverse ways different cultures expressed their devotion to the Emperor. Major hive cities featured towering cathedral complexes that served as focal points for urban religious life, their soaring spires visible from great distances, while providing spiritual anchors for populations numbering in the billions. These structures required enormous resources to construct and maintain, often representing collaborative efforts between ecclesiastical authorities, planetary governments, and wealthy donors who sought to demonstrate their piety through generous contributions. Regional variations in cathedral architecture reflected local building traditions, while maintaining essential elements that identified them as imperial religious sites. The Cathedral of the Golden Light on Scintilla featured the distinctive Gothic styling favored throughout the Calixis sector, with pointed arches, flying buttresses, and elaborate stone carvings depicting scenes from imperial religious history. In contrast, the Cathedral of the Eternal Vigil on Vestroia incorporated elements of local military tradition, featuring fortress-like walls and defensive positions that reflected the world's martial culture, while providing appropriate spaces for religious worship. The Fraterist militia emerged during the early development of the ecclesiastical hierarchy as an informal military force composed of religious zealots willing to defend church interests through armed action. These irregular forces drew their membership from devout imperial citizens who viewed military service in defense of the faith as a form of religious obligation. The militia's organization remained deliberately loose, avoiding the formal military structures that might attract unwanted attention from imperial authorities concerned about ecclesiastical military power. The Fraterist militia's activities during the Age of Apostasy demonstrated both the potential value and inherent dangers of religious military forces. Under Goge Vandar's leadership, militia units became instruments of oppression that terrorized imperial citizens in the name of religious purity. However, during Sebastian Thor's rebellion, other militia formations provided crucial support for legitimate religious authority against Vandar's tyranny. The militia's dual role as both oppressor and liberator highlighted the complex relationship between religious enthusiasm and military power within imperial society. The formal prohibition of ecclesiastical military forces following the age of apostasy led to the gradual transformation of the fraterist militia into the Adeptus Sororitas, a specialized military order that served the church while maintaining independence from direct ecclesiastical control. This transition required careful negotiation between church authorities, the High Lords of Terra, and the emerging sisterhood leadership. The solution preserved the church's access to dedicated military support while ensuring that religious military forces remained subject to appropriate oversight and control. The Adeptus Sororitas developed into a highly professional military organization that combined exceptional combat effectiveness with unwavering religious devotion. The order's militant maintained their own command structures, training facilities, and operational doctrines while accepting missions assigned by ecclesiastical authorities. The Order of Our Martyred Lady established its primary convent on Ophelia 7, where sister warriors underwent intensive training in both combat techniques and theological study. The facility's combination of military installations and religious architecture reflected the dual nature of the sisterhood's mission. The relationship between the Adeptus Sororitas and the broader ecclesiastical hierarchy required careful balance between military effectiveness and religious authority. Canonist commanders who led major Sororitas forces held sufficient independence to make tactical decisions without constant ecclesiastical oversight, while maintaining close coordination with church authorities regarding strategic objectives and operational priorities. This arrangement allowed the sisterhood to function as an effective military force, while ensuring that their activities remained consistent with broader ecclesiastical goals and imperial religious doctrine. The integration of military and religious functions within the Adeptus Sororitas created unique institutional characteristics that distinguished the sisterhood from other imperial military organizations. Sister warriors combined combat training with theological education, developing expertise in both warfare and imperial doctrine that enabled them to serve effectively in diverse operational environments. Their dual role as soldiers and religious exemplars made them particularly valuable for missions involving the suppression of heretical movements or the protection of important religious sites and personnel. The establishment of ecclesiastical hierarchy created the institutional framework necessary for defining and enforcing religious orthodoxy across the Imperium's vast expanse. However, the practical challenge of determining what constituted proper imperial faith versus dangerous heresy required careful theological development and administrative precision. The Adeptus Ministorum faced the monumental task of creating doctrinal standards that could accommodate the diverse expressions of faith found throughout imperial space, while maintaining sufficient unity to prevent the fragmentation that had plagued earlier religious movements. The core tenets of imperial cult orthodoxy emerged through centuries of theological debate within the Holy Synod, refined through practical experience in managing religious affairs across countless worlds. At the foundation of all Orthodox belief stood the absolute divinity of the Emperor of mankind, not merely as an exceptional human leader, but as the one true God deserving of humanity's complete devotion. This fundamental doctrine required careful articulation to distinguish imperial faith from the primitive god worship that the emperor had once opposed during the Great Crusade. Ecclesiastical scholars developed sophisticated theological frameworks that explained how the emperor's divine nature had always existed, but remained concealed during the secular period for strategic purposes. The emperor's divinity encompassed multiple aspects that reflected his role as humanity's ultimate protector and guide. As the master of mankind, he represented divine authority over all human affairs, legitimizing imperial governmental structures as expressions of his will. As the guardian of Terra, he embodied the sacred connection between humanity and its ancestral homeworld, making pilgrimage to Terra the highest expression of religious devotion. As the light in the darkness, he provided spiritual protection against the corrupting influences of chaos, offering hope and salvation to faithful believers who maintained proper devotion to his divine person. The sanctity of Terra formed the second pillar of Orthodox imperial belief, establishing the emperor's throne world as the holiest site in human space. Orthodox doctrine taught that Terra's sacred nature derived not only from the emperor's physical presence upon the golden throne, but from its role as humanity's birth world and the center of divine authority. Every grain of soil on Terra carried sacred significance, while the air itself possessed purifying properties that cleansed pilgrims of spiritual contamination. The imperial palace represented the ultimate expression of divine architecture, its towering spires reaching toward the heavens, while its foundations extended deep into Terra's sacred earth. The concept of Terra's sanctity extended beyond mere reverence to encompass practical religious obligations for all imperial citizens. Orthodox doctrine required that faithful believers orient their prayers toward Terra, acknowledging the emperor's physical location while demonstrating proper submission to divine authority. Religious calendars throughout the Imperium synchronized their observances with Terra's solar cycles, creating temporal unity that transcended the vast distances separating imperial worlds. The most devout believers saved throughout their lifetimes for pilgrimage journeys to Terra, viewing such expeditions as the culmination of religious devotion and the pathway to spiritual purification. Humanity's manifest destiny constituted the third fundamental tenet of imperial orthodoxy, establishing the theological framework for imperial expansion and the subjugation of alien species. Orthodox doctrine proclaimed that the emperor had chosen humanity as his special people, destined to inherit dominion over the entire galaxy through divine favor and righteous conquest. This theological position provided religious justification for the Imperium's aggressive expansion, while condemning any cooperation with alien species as betrayal of humanity's divine calling. The doctrine of manifest destiny required careful theological development to address practical questions about the relationship between divine favor and military conquest. Church scholars developed sophisticated arguments explaining how imperial victories demonstrated the emperor's blessing, while military defeats represented tests of faith or punishment for insufficient devotion. The concept of righteous warfare emerged as a central element of Orthodox belief, distinguishing between wars of conquest that advanced humanity's divine mission and conflicts motivated by mere secular ambition or personal gain. Orthodox imperial doctrine also established clear hierarchies of spiritual authority that paralleled the ecclesiastical administrative structure. The emperor's divine will flow downward through the ecclesiarch and other senior church officials, who possessed special authority to interpret religious law and establish binding doctrinal positions. Local priests and other clergy served as conduits for divine grace, while lacking independent authority to modify or reinterpret fundamental religious teachings. Ordinary believers received salvation through proper submission to ecclesiastical authority, combined with faithful observance of prescribed religious duties. The identification and classification of heretical beliefs required extensive theological work to establish clear boundaries between acceptable diversity and dangerous deviation. The Adeptus Ministorum developed comprehensive taxonomies of heretical thought that enabled local clergy to recognize and respond appropriately to various forms of religious error. These classification systems distinguished between minor doctrinal mistakes that could be corrected through education and fundamental heresies that required more severe intervention to prevent their spread throughout imperial populations. Mutation represented one of the most clearly defined categories of heresy, as physical deviation from human norms suggested spiritual corruption that threatened the purity of the emperor's chosen people. Orthodox doctrine taught that the human form reflected divine design, making any alteration or deviation a form of blasphemy against the emperor's creative authority. This theological position provided religious justification for the systematic persecution of mutants, while encouraging imperial citizens to report suspected mutations to appropriate authorities. The Church developed detailed guidelines for identifying various forms of mutation, training clergy to recognize subtle physical changes that might indicate spiritual corruption. The treatment of mutation as heresy created complex practical challenges for imperial society, particularly in regions where environmental factors or industrial processes produced higher rates of genetic deviation. Church authorities needed to balance theological purity with practical necessities, developing nuanced approaches that distinguished between acceptable minor variations and dangerous mutations that required immediate intervention. The concept of sanctioned mutation emerged to address cases where genetic modification served imperial interests, such as the specialized adaptations found among certain Space Marine chapters or the cybernetic enhancements common within the Adeptus Mechanicus. Psyker abilities presented another major category of potential heresy, as unsanctioned psychic powers suggested dangerous connections to the warp that could facilitate chaos corruption. Orthodox doctrine acknowledged that psychic abilities represented gifts from the Emperor to certain chosen individuals, but emphasized that such powers required careful regulation and control to prevent their misuse. The Church worked closely with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica to identify and evaluate psychers, ensuring that individuals with psychic abilities received appropriate training and oversight while screening out those whose powers might pose threats to imperial security. The theological framework surrounding psyker abilities required careful balance between acknowledging their divine origin and recognizing their inherent dangers. Church doctrine taught that psychic powers flowed from the Emperor's own divine essence, making sanctioned psychers valuable servants of the imperial cause. However, the same doctrine emphasized that unsanctioned psychic activity represented a form of theft from the Emperor's divine authority, justifying severe punishment for individuals who used their abilities without proper authorization and oversight. Alien worship constituted a particularly serious form of heresy that directly contradicted humanity's manifest destiny and the Emperor's exclusive claim to divine authority. Orthodox doctrine condemned any veneration of Xeno's entities as fundamental betrayal of human nature and divine calling. This theological position extended beyond formal religious practices to encompass any expression of respect or admiration for alien cultures, technologies, or achievements. The Church taught that exposure to alien influence inevitably led to spiritual corruption, making isolation from Xeno's contact a religious obligation for faithful imperial citizens. The practical enforcement of anti-alien doctrines required extensive cooperation between ecclesiastical authorities and other imperial institutions. The Inquisition's Ordo Xenos worked closely with church officials to identify and eliminate alien cults that might emerge within imperial populations. Military forces received regular religious instruction emphasizing the spiritual dangers of alien contact, while civilian populations underwent periodic doctrinal education to reinforce their understanding of humanity's special relationship with the Emperor. Chaos corruption represented the most dangerous and insidious form of heresy, as it involved direct spiritual contamination by the Imperium's greatest enemies. Orthodox doctrine taught that the Chaos gods represented false deities that sought to corrupt and destroy humanity through deception and temptation. The Church developed extensive theological frameworks for understanding chaos corruption, identifying its various manifestations, and establishing procedures for recognizing and responding to its influence within imperial society. The four primary chaos gods each presented distinct forms of corruption that required specialized theological responses. Khorne's influence manifested through excessive violence and bloodshed that exceeded the righteous warfare sanctioned by imperial doctrine. Tzeentch's corruption appeared through forbidden knowledge and uncontrolled change that contradicted the stable order the Emperor had established for human society. Nurgle's contamination spread through disease and decay that violated the purity of the human form, while Slaanesh's influence promoted excessive pleasure and sensation that distracted believers from proper religious devotion. The Ordo Hereticus emerged as the Inquisition's primary tool for investigating and combating heretical beliefs within imperial society. These specialized inquisitors worked closely with ecclesiastical authorities to identify dangerous religious movements while maintaining the independence necessary for objective investigation. The relationship between the Ordo Hereticus and the Adeptus Ministorum required careful balance, as both organizations claimed authority over matters involving faith and heresy, but approached these issues from different institutional perspectives. Ordo Hereticus inquisitors received extensive training in theological matters to enable them to distinguish between orthodox religious practices and dangerous heretical movements. This education included detailed study of imperial doctrine, comparative analysis of various heretical belief systems, and practical techniques for investigating suspected religious crimes. Many inquisitors maintained close relationships with senior ecclesiastical officials who could provide expert consultation on complex theological questions that arose during investigations. The prosecution of heretical beliefs followed established procedures that balanced the need for thorough investigation with the practical requirements of maintaining imperial stability. Minor doctrinal errors typically received correction through re-education programs administered by local clergy, while more serious heresies required formal investigation by inquisitorial authorities. The most dangerous forms of heretical belief, particularly those involving chaos corruption, warranted immediate and decisive intervention to prevent their spread throughout imperial populations. The ecclesiarchy's role in identifying heretical movements relied heavily on the extensive network of clergy who maintained direct contact with imperial citizens throughout the galaxy. Parish priests served as the primary early warning system for detecting dangerous religious movements, reporting suspicious activities to their ecclesiastical superiors who could coordinate with inquisitorial authorities when necessary. This system required careful training for local clergy to ensure they could distinguish between harmless religious enthusiasm and potentially dangerous heretical activity. The purging of heretical beliefs often required coordinated action between multiple imperial institutions, as dangerous religious movements frequently posed both spiritual and security threats. The Adeptus Sororitas provided specialized military forces trained in combating heretical movements while maintaining appropriate religious perspective on their mission. Imperial Guard regiments received support from military confessors who could identify and counter heretical propaganda while providing spiritual guidance to soldiers exposed to corrupting influences during anti-heresy operations. Regional doctrinal variations presented ongoing challenges for maintaining theological unity across the Imperium's vast expanse. Different worlds developed distinctive expressions of imperial faith that reflected local cultures and historical experiences while remaining within the bounds of orthodox doctrine. The Church needed to accommodate this diversity without allowing it to fragment into incompatible belief systems that might undermine imperial unity or provide openings for heretical infiltration. The management of regional variations required sophisticated theological frameworks that could distinguish between acceptable diversity and dangerous deviation. The Holy Synod regularly reviewed reports from throughout imperial space, identifying emerging doctrinal trends that might require intervention while recognizing legitimate expressions of local religious culture. This process involved extensive consultation with regional ecclesiastical authorities who possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions and could provide context for understanding unusual religious practices. The challenge of maintaining theological unity across galactic distances required innovative approaches to religious communication and education. The Church developed standardized educational curricula that could be adapted to local conditions while preserving essential doctrinal elements. Traveling missionary priests carried official religious teachings to isolated regions while reporting back on local religious developments that might require attention from higher ecclesiastical authorities. The ongoing struggle to balance unity with diversity reflected deeper tensions within imperial society between central authority and local autonomy. The Adeptus Ministorum needed to maintain sufficient doctrinal flexibility to accommodate the vast cultural diversity found throughout imperial space, while preserving the theological foundations that justified imperial political authority and social organization. This balance required constant adjustment as new worlds entered the Imperium and existing populations developed new expressions of their faith in response to changing circumstances. The systematic development of orthodox doctrine and heretical classifications created the theological framework necessary for maintaining imperial religious unity, but these carefully constructed systems would face their greatest test during the catastrophic period known as the Age of Apostasy. This dark chapter in imperial history demonstrated how ecclesiastical power, when divorced from proper restraint and spiritual humility, could become as dangerous to the Imperium as any external threat. The events of the 36th millennium would forever reshape the relationship between religious and secular authority, while establishing precedents that would govern ecclesiastical conduct for the next 4 millennia. Goj Vander's rise to power began not through religious zealotry, but through administrative competence within the Adeptus Administratum's vast bureaucratic machinery. Born on the industrial world of Gathalammer, Vander demonstrated exceptional organizational abilities and ruthless efficiency in managing complex governmental operations. His early career involved overseeing taxation collection across multiple subsectors, where he developed both the administrative skills and cynical worldview that would characterize his later actions. Unlike many ecclesiastical figures of his era, Vander approached religion primarily as a tool for political control rather than a source of genuine spiritual guidance. The political circumstances that enabled Vander's unprecedented accumulation of power reflected broader weaknesses within imperial governmental structures during the late 35th millennium. The High Lords of Terra had grown increasingly factional and ineffective, with various imperial institutions pursuing conflicting agendas that undermined coordinated governance. The Adeptus Administratum struggled with corruption and inefficiency that hampered essential governmental functions, while the emerging Adeptus Ministorum lacked the institutional maturity necessary for effective oversight of its growing responsibilities. Vander's appointment as master of the Adeptus Administratum occurred during a period of particular governmental crisis when traditional candidates proved unable to address the mounting administrative failures plaguing imperial operations. His reputation for harsh but effective management made him attractive to High Lords desperate for someone capable of imposing order on the chaotic bureaucratic situation. The appointment carried enormous authority over imperial taxation, resource allocation, and administrative personnel throughout the galaxy, providing Vander with unprecedented leverage over other imperial institutions. The simultaneous vacancy in the position of ecclesiarch created the opportunity for Vander's most audacious power grab. The previous ecclesiarch's death had left the Adeptus Ministorum without clear leadership at a crucial moment when the Church required strong direction to address growing theological disputes and administrative challenges. Vander recognized that combining ecclesiastical and administrative authority would create a concentration of power unprecedented in imperial history, enabling him to control both the spiritual and material resources necessary for absolute dominance over imperial society. Vander's manipulation of the selection process for ecclesiarch demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of imperial political dynamics and institutional weaknesses. He cultivated relationships with key cardinals who possessed influence over ecclesiastical appointments, while using his administrative authority to provide favorable resource allocations to potential supporters. His campaign for the position emphasized his administrative experience and promised to bring efficiency to church operations, appealing to ecclesiastical officials frustrated with the organizational problems that had plagued the Adeptus Ministorum during its rapid expansion. The formal appointment of Vander as ecclesiarch violated numerous precedents regarding the separation of religious and secular authority within imperial governance. Previous arrangements had carefully maintained institutional independence between major imperial organizations to prevent any single individual from accumulating excessive power. The High Lord's approval of Vander's dual appointment reflected their desperation to address mounting governmental crises rather than careful consideration of the long-term implications of such unprecedented concentration of authority. Vander's early actions, as both master of the Adeptus Administratum and ecclesiarch, initially appeared to justify the controversial appointment. He implemented administrative reforms that improved efficiency in both governmental and ecclesiastical operations, streamlined communication between different imperial institutions, and addressed several long-standing bureaucratic problems that had hindered effective governance. These early successes convinced many observers that the combination of administrative and religious authority might provide solutions to imperial governmental challenges. The gradual corruption of Vander's rule began with relatively minor abuses of power that escalated into increasingly tyrannical behavior as his authority went unchallenged. His control over both administrative resources and religious doctrine enabled him to suppress criticism through multiple channels, using bureaucratic procedures to punish secular opponents while employing religious authority to condemn spiritual dissent as heretical. The combination proved devastatingly effective at silencing opposition while creating an atmosphere of fear that prevented organized resistance from forming. Vander's theological innovations reflected his instrumental approach to religion rather than genuine spiritual conviction. He proclaimed new doctrines that emphasized absolute obedience to ecclesiastical authority while portraying himself as the emperor's chosen representative on Terra. These teachings departed significantly from established imperial doctrine, which had traditionally maintained clear distinctions between the emperor's divine authority and the delegated power of his earthly servants. Vander's claims to speak directly for the emperor represented a fundamental corruption of orthodox theological principles. The brides of the emperor emerged during this period as Vander's personal military force, recruited from the Schola Progenium facilities under his administrative control. These young women received intensive training in both combat techniques and fanatical devotion to Vander's person, creating a force that combined exceptional military effectiveness with absolute loyalty to their patron. The bride served as Vander's bodyguard and enforcement arm, carrying out his increasingly brutal commands without question or hesitation. The recruitment process for the brides reflected Vander's systematic exploitation of imperial institutions for personal gain. He identified promising candidates among the Schola Progenium students whose families had died in imperial service, targeting individuals whose isolation and grief made them susceptible to manipulation. The training programs combined legitimate military instruction with psychological conditioning designed to transfer the candidates' natural loyalty to the emperor toward Vander personally. The result was a force of fanatically devoted warriors who viewed service to Vander as the highest expression of imperial loyalty. The bride's distinctive equipment and appearance reflected both practical military considerations and Vander's desire to create an imposing symbol of his power. They wore ornate power armor decorated with religious iconography that proclaimed their status as holy warriors while providing exceptional protection in combat situations. Their weapons included specialized flamers and melee weapons that proved devastatingly effective in the urban combat environments where they typically operated. The sight of the brides marching through imperial cities became synonymous with Vander's oppressive rule. The reign of blood that characterized Vander's mature tyranny involved systematic persecution of anyone who questioned his authority or challenged his increasingly extreme religious pronouncements. His control over both administrative and ecclesiastical institutions enabled him to identify potential opponents through multiple intelligence networks while employing various methods of suppression and elimination. Imperial citizens found themselves subject to arbitrary arrest, confiscation of property, and execution based on denunciations that might stem from personal grudges rather than genuine disloyalty. Vander's persecution of other imperial institutions reflected his recognition that organized opposition posed the greatest threat to his continued dominance. He systematically purged the Adeptus administratum of officials who maintained loyalty to traditional imperial governmental principles, replacing them with sycophants whose careers depended entirely on his favor. The Adeptus Ministorum underwent similar purges, as Vander eliminated clergy who adhered to orthodox theological positions that conflicted with his personal doctrines. The economic impact of Vander's rule created widespread hardship throughout imperial space, as resources were diverted to support his increasingly extravagant lifestyle and military forces. Taxation rates increased dramatically to fund the construction of massive monuments to Vander's glory, while essential governmental services deteriorated due to neglect and mismanagement. Trade networks suffered disruption as arbitrary regulations and confiscations undermined commercial confidence, leading to economic decline that affected entire sectors of imperial space. The growing resistance to Vander's tyranny initially took the form of isolated protests and underground movements that lacked coordination or effective leadership. Individual worlds attempted to resist his most extreme demands, leading to brutal suppression campaigns that demonstrated the ruthless efficiency of his military forces. The Brides of the Emperor proved particularly effective at crushing local resistance, their fanatical devotion and superior equipment enabling them to defeat larger, but less well-equipped opposition forces. The intervention of the Adeptus Custodes marked the turning point in the struggle against Vander's tyranny, as these ancient guardians of the emperor recognized that his rule threatened the fundamental principles of imperial governance. The Custodes had remained largely aloof from imperial politics since the Horus Heresy, focusing their attention on protecting the emperor's physical form and maintaining the Golden Throne's operation. However, Vander's claims to speak directly for the emperor represented a direct challenge to their sacred duties as the emperor's chosen guardians. The Custodes' decision to act against Vander required careful consideration of their role within imperial governmental structures and their responsibility to preserve the emperor's true will. They recognized that direct military intervention might create dangerous precedents that could destabilize imperial governance, but concluded that Vander's corruption had reached levels that threatened the Imperium's fundamental stability. The Custodes' ancient oaths bound them to protect the emperor's interests above all other considerations, making action against Vander a sacred duty rather than political interference. The confrontation between the Custodes and the Brides of the Emperor occurred within the imperial palace itself, as Vander's bodyguards attempted to prevent the ancient guardians from reaching their master. The battle demonstrated the vast gulf in capability between the Custodes and even the most elite mortal warriors, as the Emperor's guardians systematically dismantled the Bride's defensive positions with minimal casualties to their own forces. The Brides fought with desperate courage, but their fanatical devotion could not compensate for the enormous disparity in equipment, training, and experience. The Custodes' revelation of the Emperor's true condition to the surviving brides proved more decisive than their military victory. These young women had been conditioned to view Vander as the Emperor's chosen representative, making their loyalty to him a form of religious devotion rather than mere personal attachment. When the Custodes brought them into the presence of the Golden Throne and revealed the Emperor's actual state, the shock shattered their psychological conditioning and forced them to confront the reality of Vander's deception. The transformation of the brides into the daughters of the Emperor represented their rejection of Vander's corruption and their embrace of genuine imperial loyalty. This change involved both psychological healing from their previous conditioning and practical retraining in orthodox imperial doctrine and military procedures. The process required careful guidance from the Custodes and other loyal imperial institutions to ensure that the former brides could channel their martial skills and religious devotion toward legitimate imperial service. Sebastian Thor's emergence as the leader of legitimate religious opposition to Vander's tyranny provided the focal point necessary for coordinating resistance across imperial space. Thor possessed the theological knowledge, charismatic leadership, and organizational skills required to challenge Vander's religious authority while offering a credible alternative vision of Imperial faith. His background as a simple preacher from the Dimamur system gave him credibility with ordinary Imperial citizens who had suffered under Vandar's oppressive rule. Thor's theological critique of Vandar's regime focused on the fundamental contradictions between the tyrant's claims and established Imperial doctrine. He demonstrated how Vandar's assertions of direct, divine authority violated orthodox teachings about the relationship between the Emperor and his earthly servants. Thor's sermons emphasized that true Imperial faith required humility and service, rather than the arrogance and self-aggrandizement that characterized Vandar's rule. These theological arguments provided intellectual foundation for resistance while appealing to the religious convictions of Imperial citizens. The formation of the Confederation of Light represented the practical organization of resistance to Vandar's tyranny, bringing together diverse elements of Imperial society, united by their opposition to his corrupt rule. The coalition included Orthodox clergy who had maintained loyalty to traditional Imperial doctrine, military officers who refused to support Vandar's increasingly extreme policies, and civilian leaders who recognized the threat his rule posed to Imperial stability. The Confederation's diverse membership reflected the broad-based nature of opposition to Vandar's tyranny. The military campaigns that characterized the later stages of the Age of Apostasy involved complex operations across multiple star systems as the Confederation of Light sought to liberate Imperial worlds from Vandar's control. These conflicts required careful coordination between regular Imperial military forces and the irregular units that had formed around Sebastian Thor's religious movement. The integration of Orthodox clergy into military operations provided spiritual guidance for resistance forces while helping to maintain discipline and morale during extended campaigns. The siege of the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra represented the climactic confrontation of the Age of Apostasy, as Thor's forces sought to remove Vandar from his position of power while minimizing damage to the sacred sites and institutions of Imperial governance. The operation required exceptional planning and coordination to navigate the complex political and military challenges involved in conducting warfare within the heart of Imperial power. The participation of the Adeptus Custodes provided crucial support while lending legitimacy to the resistance movement. Vandar's final defeat and execution marked the end of his tyrannical rule, but left the Imperium facing the enormous task of repairing the damage caused by his corruption. The institutional reforms that followed would reshape the relationship between religious and secular authority, while establishing safeguards designed to prevent similar concentrations of power in the future. Sebastian Thor's elevation to the position of ecclesiarch represented not merely a change in leadership, but a fundamental reformation of ecclesiastical governance and doctrine. The institutional reforms that followed Sebastian Thor's victory over Goge Vandar fundamentally transformed the relationship between ecclesiastical authority and military power within the Imperium. The decree passive, issued by the reformed High Lords of Terra, explicitly prohibited the Adeptus Ministorum from maintaining men under arms, a restriction designed to prevent future ecclesiastical tyranny, while acknowledging the Church's legitimate need for protection in a galaxy filled with heretics and enemies of the faith. This seemingly simple prohibition would give birth to one of the Imperium's most formidable military organizations through a combination of legal interpretation, theological innovation, and practical necessity. The surviving members of Vandar's Brides of the Emperor faced an uncertain future following their master's downfall and their dramatic revelation before the Golden Throne. These young women had been conditioned for absolute loyalty and military service, possessing exceptional combat skills, but lacking any identity beyond their role as Vandar's personal guard. The Adeptus Custodes, recognizing both their potential value and the dangers of leaving such capable warriors without purpose, took responsibility for their rehabilitation and retraining. The process required careful psychological work to help the former brides overcome their conditioning while channeling their martial abilities toward legitimate Imperial service. Alicia Dominica emerged as the natural leader among the former brides, her exceptional combat abilities matched by the charismatic authority she had wielded even during Vander's reign. The experience before the Golden Throne had affected her more profoundly than her sisters, instilling a mystical devotion to the Emperor that transcended mere loyalty to become genuine religious calling. Under the guidance of the Custodes and Sebastian Thor himself, Dominica began developing the theological and organizational frameworks that would define the emerging sisterhood. Her vision combined the martial excellence the brides had achieved under Vander with orthodox imperial doctrine and genuine spiritual devotion. The legal foundation for the Adeptus sororitas emerged through careful interpretation of the decree, passive specific wording, while the prohibition against men under arms clearly applied to male military forces. Legal scholars within the Adeptus Ministorum argued that female warriors fell outside the decree's scope. This interpretation required extensive theological justification to demonstrate that women could serve as legitimate military forces without violating the spirit of the reforms designed to prevent ecclesiastical tyranny. The argument drew upon ancient imperial traditions that recognized the distinct roles of men and women in service to the emperor, while emphasizing that female warriors posed less risk of political ambition than their male counterparts. The establishment of the Order's militant represented the practical implementation of this legal interpretation, creating formal military structures within the Adeptus sororitas while maintaining appropriate separation from direct ecclesiastical control. The First Orders drew their initial membership from the former brides of the emperor and other women who had demonstrated exceptional devotion during the struggle against Vander's tyranny. These founding members brought combat experience and religious fervor that provided the foundation for developing the distinctive culture that would characterize the sisterhood for millennia to come. The Order of Our Martyred Lady became the first and largest of the Order's militant, established on Ophelia 7 under Alicia Dominica's direct leadership. The Order's name honored the memory of those who had died opposing Vander's tyranny, while establishing martyrdom as a central element of sororitas theology. The convent fortress constructed on Ophelia 7 combined military installations with religious architecture, featuring training facilities capable of producing the galaxy's most elite female warriors, alongside chapels and meditation chambers that fostered the spiritual development essential to the sisterhood's mission. The complex's design reflected the dual nature of the sisters' calling, with armories adjacent to libraries containing theological texts and combat training grounds overlooked by towering statues of imperial saints. The recruitment practices developed by the Order of Our Martyred Lady established patterns that would be adopted throughout the Adeptus sororitas. Candidates typically came from the Schola Progenium, where the orphan daughters of imperial servants received education that combined academic instruction with physical training and religious indoctrination. The selection process identified young women who demonstrated exceptional devotion to imperial doctrine alongside the physical and mental attributes necessary for military service. Those chosen for the sisterhood underwent additional years of intensive training that transformed them into warriors capable of matching the combat effectiveness of Space Marines, while maintaining the spiritual purity that made them immune to chaos corruption. The training regimens developed within the Order's militant pushed candidates to the absolute limits of human capability, while fostering the unshakable faith that defined the sisterhood's character. Physical conditioning involved grueling exercises designed to build strength, endurance, and pain tolerance necessary for combat in power armor against superhuman opponents. Combat instruction covered not only conventional weapons and tactics, but also the specialized equipment that would become synonymous with the Adeptus sororitas, including flamers, meltaguns, and chain weapons that reflected their role in purging heretics and cleansing corruption. Theological education remained equally important, as sisters needed to recognize heretical doctrines and resist the psychological warfare employed by chaos cultists and other enemies of the faith. The distinctive power armor worn by the Adeptus sororitas combined practical protection with religious symbolism that proclaimed their status as the Emperor's chosen warriors. The armor's design incorporated elements reminiscent of classical religious vestments, with flowing lines and decorative elements that maintained feminine aesthetics, while providing comprehensive protection against the weapons employed by the Imperium's enemies. The distinctive helmet design featured a T-shaped visor that evoked both classical warrior traditions and religious iconography, while the armor's surface bore purity seals, devotional inscriptions, and other religious markings that demonstrated the wearer's faith and dedication. The Order of the Valorous Heart emerged as the second major order's militant, established to serve the growing need for Adeptus Sororitas forces throughout Imperial space. Based on the shrine world of San Lear, this order developed its own distinctive traditions while maintaining the fundamental principles that define the sisterhood. The Order of the Valorous Heart specialized in defensive operations and the protection of sacred sites, developing tactics and equipment optimized for holding fortified positions against overwhelming enemy forces. Their convent fortress incorporated advanced defensive systems and training facilities designed to prepare sisters for the challenges of protecting imperial shrines, cathedrals, and other religious sites from heretical assault. The recruitment pool for the Order of the Valorous Heart drew heavily from worlds with strong military traditions, seeking candidates who combined natural warrior instincts with deep religious conviction. The Order's training emphasized discipline, sacrifice, and unwavering determination in the face of impossible odds. Sisters of the Valorous Heart learned to view death in service to the Emperor not as failure, but as the ultimate expression of devotion, developing a fatalistic courage that made them exceptionally effective in desperate defensive actions. Their battle cry for the Emperor and the Fallen reflected their willingness to join the ranks of martyrs whose sacrifice protected the faithful from corruption and destruction. The Order of the Bloody Rose represented the most aggressive and militant of the major orders, specializing in assault operations and the active hunting of heretics throughout Imperial space. Established on Terra itself within sight of the Imperial Palace, this order maintained closer ties to the Adeptus Custodes and other imperial institutions than their sister orders. The proximity to the Golden Throne instilled an even more intense devotion in the Sisters of the Bloody Rose, who viewed themselves as the Emperor's personal instruments of vengeance against those who defied his divine will. Their training emphasized rapid deployment, shock tactics, and the psychological impact of their appearance on enemy forces. The Order of the Bloody Rose developed specialized equipment and tactics for their role as the Imperium's premier anti-heresy force. Their power armor incorporated additional close combat weapons and enhanced mobility systems that enabled rapid assault operations in urban environments where heretical cults typically operated. The Order's flamers received special consecration rituals that enhanced their effectiveness against demonic entities, while their chainswords bore blessed chains that could cut through both physical armor and spiritual corruption. The sight of Sisters of the Bloody Rose advancing through burning streets became synonymous with imperial justice and divine retribution. The relationship between the Adeptus Sororitas and the Ordo Hereticus emerged through practical cooperation in combating heretical movements throughout imperial space. The Inquisition's specialized branch, dedicated to investigating internal threats to imperial security, required military forces capable of operating with absolute discretion while maintaining immunity to the corrupting influences they encountered. The Sisterhood's combination of exceptional combat effectiveness and unshakable faith made them ideal partners for inquisitors pursuing dangerous heretical cults and chaos-influenced organizations within imperial society. The formal designation of the Adepta Sororitas as the chamber militant of the Ordo Hereticus established institutional frameworks for cooperation while maintaining appropriate independence for both organizations. Inquisitors gained access to military forces whose loyalty and purity were beyond question, while the Sisterhood received additional resources and authority necessary for their expanding role in protecting imperial society from internal threats. The arrangement required careful balance to ensure that inquisitorial authority did not compromise the sisters' independence or transform them into mere tools of secular power. Joint operations between the Adeptus Sororitas and Ordo Hereticus typically involved complex investigations that required both detective work and military action to resolve successfully. Inquisitors provided the specialized knowledge and authority necessary for identifying heretical movements, while sisters supplied the combat capability needed to eliminate discovered threats. These partnerships often lasted for years as investigations traced heretical networks across multiple star systems, requiring sustained cooperation between individuals with very different training and institutional backgrounds. The non-militant orders within the Adeptus Sororitas provided essential services that supported both the military orders and broader Imperial society. These organizations demonstrated that the Sisterhood's mission extended far beyond warfare to encompass the full range of activities necessary for maintaining Imperial civilization. The orders Hospitaller, Dialogus, and Famulus each developed specialized roles that utilized the exceptional dedication and training that characterized all members of the Adeptus Sororitas while serving civilian populations throughout Imperial space. The orders Hospitaller emerged from the recognition that the Imperium's vast population required medical services that combined advanced healing techniques with spiritual care for the faithful. These sisters received extensive training in both medical procedures and theological counseling, enabling them to address both physical ailments and spiritual concerns that affected Imperial citizens. The Order's Hospitaller established hospitals and medical facilities throughout Imperial space, often in regions where conventional Imperial medical services were inadequate or non-existent. Their facilities served not only as treatment centers, but as training institutions where local populations learned basic medical techniques and proper spiritual approaches to healing. The medical training provided to Sisters Hospitaller rivaled that available within the Adeptus Mechanicus, though with greater emphasis on caring for unaugmented human patients rather than maintaining mechanical systems. These sisters learned to perform complex surgical procedures, treat exotic diseases encountered throughout Imperial space, and provide emergency medical care in combat zones and disaster areas. Their theological training enabled them to provide spiritual comfort to dying patients, while ensuring that medical treatments remained consistent with Imperial religious doctrine. The combination of medical expertise and religious authority made Sisters Hospitaller particularly effective in treating populations affected by heretical corruption or other spiritual ailments. The Order's Dialogus developed from the practical need for linguistic expertise in an Imperium spanning millions of worlds with countless different languages and cultural traditions. These sisters specialized in translation, communication, and cultural analysis that enabled Imperial institutions to operate effectively across the vast diversity of human civilization. Members of the Order's Dialogus mastered multiple languages while developing deep understanding of the cultural contexts that shaped communication patterns on different worlds. Their services proved essential for diplomatic missions, trade negotiations, and religious instruction in regions where standard Imperial Gothic was not widely understood. The linguistic training provided to Sisters Dialogus encompassed not only spoken and written languages, but also the subtle cultural cues that affected communication effectiveness. These sisters learned to recognize regional variations in Imperial doctrine that might create misunderstandings during religious instruction or diplomatic negotiations. Their expertise extended to ancient languages and archaic dialects that appeared in historical documents and religious texts, making them valuable resources for scholarly research and theological study. Many Sisters Dialogus served as interpreters for high-ranking Imperial officials during important negotiations or ceremonial events where precise communication was essential. The Order's Famulus addressed the complex social and political challenges that affected noble houses and other elite families throughout Imperial space. These sisters received training in etiquette, politics, genealogy, and household management that enabled them to serve as advisors, tutors, and administrators within aristocratic households. Their presence provided noble families with access to individuals whose loyalty and discretion were absolutely reliable, while ensuring that elite imperial citizens received appropriate religious instruction and moral guidance. The Order's famulus played crucial roles in maintaining the complex web of relationships that bound imperial nobility together across vast distances. The training provided to Sisters famulus encompassed both practical household management skills and sophisticated understanding of imperial politics and social structures. These sisters learned to navigate the complex protocols that governed interactions between different noble houses while maintaining appropriate religious perspective on secular political matters. Their genealogical expertise proved particularly valuable in resolving inheritance disputes and marriage negotiations that could affect the stability of entire sectors. Many Sisters famulus served for decades within single noble households, becoming trusted advisors whose counsel influenced important political decisions throughout imperial space. The integration of all these diverse orders within the broader Adeptus Sororitas organization required sophisticated administrative structures that could coordinate activities across multiple specializations while maintaining the unity of purpose that defined the sisterhood. The Canonist Superior, who led each major order, possessed authority comparable to senior imperial commanders, managing resources and personnel on a scale that rivaled entire Imperial Guard regiments. These leaders needed to balance the specific requirements of their order's mission with the broader goals of the Adeptus Sororitas and the imperial institutions they served. The selection and training of senior leadership within the Adeptus Sororitas emphasized both military competence and spiritual authority necessary for commanding warriors whose devotion to the Emperor transcended normal concepts of loyalty and obedience. Canonist superiors typically rose through the ranks after demonstrating exceptional performance in both combat and administrative roles, proving their ability to inspire absolute confidence among their subordinates while maintaining the theological knowledge necessary for making complex doctrinal decisions. The position required individuals capable of balancing competing demands from imperial institutions while preserving the independence that enabled the sisterhood to serve as an effective check on potential ecclesiastical corruption. The establishment of the Adeptus Sororitas as the Emperor's chosen warriors created institutional frameworks for recognizing and venerating exceptional devotion, but the broader imperial population required spiritual exemplars whose lives demonstrated the highest expressions of faith and service. The concept of imperial sainthood emerged from the practical need to identify individuals whose extraordinary deeds transcended normal human achievement, while providing inspiration for countless believers throughout the galaxy. The process of canonization developed gradually within the Adeptus Ministorum, creating formal procedures for evaluating claims of miraculous intervention and divine favor that distinguished genuine saints from mere heroes or propaganda figures. The theological foundations of imperial sainthood required careful development to avoid the theological pitfalls that had characterized pre-imperial religious traditions. Orthodox doctrine established that saints represented exceptional human beings who had achieved such perfect devotion to the Emperor that they became conduits for his divine will, rather than independent sources of miraculous power. This distinction preserved the Emperor's unique status as the one true God, while acknowledging that certain individuals could serve as intermediaries between divine authority and mortal believers. The saints' power flowed directly from the Emperor's grace, making veneration of their deeds a form of worship directed ultimately toward the Golden Throne. The formal canonization process within the ecclesiarchy involved extensive investigation of claimed miraculous events, detailed examination of the candidate's life and teachings, and careful theological analysis to ensure compatibility with orthodox imperial doctrine. Local bishops initiated canonization proceedings by documenting extraordinary events associated with particular individuals, gathering testimony from witnesses, and compiling evidence of the candidate's exceptional devotion and moral character. These initial investigations required years of careful research, as ecclesiastical authorities sought to distinguish genuine miracles from coincidence, fraud, or heretical corruption that might masquerade as divine intervention. The Holy Synod's role in evaluating canonization cases involved sophisticated theological analysis that examined both the claimed miracles and their broader implications for imperial doctrine. Senior theologians reviewed all evidence presented by local investigators, applying rigorous standards that required multiple independent witnesses for each claimed miraculous event. The evaluation process also considered the candidates' teachings and actions throughout their life, ensuring that their example reinforced orthodox beliefs rather than promoting dangerous innovations or personal aggrandizement. The Synod's deliberations often lasted for decades, as they weighed complex theological questions about the nature of divine intervention and the proper criteria for recognizing sainthood. Saint Euphrosyne Keeler holds the distinction of being the first officially recognized imperial saint, her canonization establishing many of the precedents that would govern future cases. Keeler's transformation from a simple remembrancer, documenting the Great Crusade, into a prophetic figure whose visions revealed the emperor's divine nature, provided the theological foundation for understanding how ordinary humans could become vessels for divine revelation. Her experiences during the Horus Heresy, including her miraculous survival of demonic attack and her prophetic warnings about chaos corruption, demonstrated the reality of divine intervention in human affairs while establishing the template for future saints. Keeler's canonization required extensive theological work to reconcile her early secular role as a remembrancer with her later status as a religious prophet. Church scholars developed sophisticated arguments explaining how the emperor's divine plan had always intended for Keeler to serve as his instrument for revealing religious truth to humanity, even during her apparently secular career. Her photographic documentation of the Great Crusade was reinterpreted as divinely inspired preparation for her later role in recording the emergence of imperial faith. The theological framework surrounding her canonization established that the emperor's divine will could work through individuals long before they recognized their sacred calling. The miraculous events associated with Saint Keeler's life provided crucial precedents for evaluating future canonization cases. Her survival of direct demonic assault without any apparent protection demonstrated the emperor's active intervention on behalf of his chosen servants. Witnesses testified to her prophetic visions that accurately predicted future events, including specific warnings about chaos corruption that proved essential for imperial survival during the heresy. Her ability to inspire absolute devotion in her followers while maintaining perfect orthodoxy in her teachings established the pattern of charismatic religious leadership that would characterize many future saints. Saint Sebastian Thor's canonization occurred during his lifetime, an unprecedented decision that reflected both his extraordinary achievements in overthrowing Goge Vander and his continuing role as ecclesiarch. The theological justification for living sainthood required extensive doctrinal innovation, as previous imperial religious traditions had typically required death before considering canonization. The Holy Synod argued that Thor's defeat of Vander represented such a clear manifestation of divine will that formal recognition could not await his death. His ongoing leadership of ecclesiastical reform demonstrated that sainthood did not require martyrdom when an individual's life provided sufficient evidence of divine favor. Thor's miraculous abilities manifested primarily through his extraordinary charismatic authority and his uncanny ability to inspire religious devotion across diverse populations. Witnesses reported that his sermons could convert entire planetary populations to Orthodox imperial faith, overcoming centuries of heretical tradition through the sheer power of his preaching. His presence on battlefields reportedly inspired imperial forces to achieve impossible victories against overwhelming odds, while his prayers were credited with healing the sick and protecting the faithful from chaos corruption. These abilities demonstrated the Emperor's active support for Thor's mission, while establishing precedents for the miraculous powers associated with living saints. The Confederation of Light that supported Thor's rebellion against Vander provided numerous additional examples of miraculous intervention that supported his canonization. Military commanders reported tactical insights that came to them during prayer sessions conducted by Thor, enabling them to achieve decisive victories despite inferior numbers and equipment. Civilian populations under siege experienced miraculous deliveries of supplies that arrived precisely when starvation seemed inevitable. These events created a comprehensive pattern of divine intervention that convinced even skeptical observers that Thor's cause enjoyed supernatural support. Thor's theological innovations during the Age of Apostasy established many of the doctrinal foundations that would govern imperial sainthood for millennia to come. His teachings emphasized that true saints served as humble instruments of the emperor's will rather than seeking personal glory or aggrandizement. He distinguished between genuine miraculous intervention and the false wonders produced by chaos corruption or alien technology, providing criteria that would prove essential for evaluating future canonization cases. His reforms of ecclesiastical governance demonstrated how saintly authority could enhance rather than threaten imperial institutional stability. Saint Celestine represents perhaps the most dramatic example of living sainthood, her multiple deaths and resurrections providing unprecedented evidence of divine intervention in imperial affairs. Her initial death during the defense of the shrine world of Sanctus Laura appeared to end a distinguished but unremarkable career as a sister of the Order of Our Martyred Lady. However, her miraculous resurrection during the planet's darkest hour, accompanied by manifestations of divine power that enabled imperial forces to achieve impossible victory, established her as a unique figure in imperial religious history. Her subsequent deaths and resurrections during other critical battles created a pattern of divine intervention that defied all conventional understanding. Celestine's resurrections involve complete restoration of her physical form, accompanied by enhanced abilities that transcend normal human limitations. Witnesses describe her reappearance as accompanied by blazing light that illuminates entire battlefields while inspiring absolute confidence in imperial forces and terror in their enemies. Her restored form demonstrates physical capabilities that rival those of space marines, including the ability to fly through personal effort rather than technological assistance. The weapons and armor that appear with her resurrection bear no resemblance to standard imperial equipment, suggesting direct divine provision rather than conventional supply chains. The theological implications of Celestine's multiple resurrections required extensive doctrinal analysis to maintain consistency with orthodox imperial beliefs. Church scholars developed the concept of the living saint as a special category of divine servant who could return from death when the emperors will require their continued service. This interpretation preserved the emperor's unique status as the source of all miraculous power, while acknowledging that certain individuals could serve as permanent vessels for divine intervention. The doctrine established that living saints existed in a state between mortality and divinity, retaining their human nature while gaining access to supernatural abilities. Celestine's battlefield appearances typically occur during moments of extreme crisis, when imperial forces face seemingly impossible odds against heretical or Xenos enemies. Her arrival invariably coincides with dramatic reversals of fortune that enable imperial victory despite overwhelming disadvantages. During the 13th Black Crusade, her intervention at the Battle of Cadia provided crucial support for imperial defenders facing the full might of chaos forces. Her presence inspired desperate last stands that bought precious time for civilian evacuations, while demonstrating that the Emperor's protection extended even to the Imperium's darkest hours. The miraculous abilities demonstrated by Saint Celestine include not only personal combat effectiveness, but also the power to inspire supernatural courage and determination in nearby Imperial forces. Soldiers fighting alongside her report feeling completely immune to fear, while gaining tactical insights that enable them to achieve impossible feats of arms. Her presence reportedly heals wounded Imperial warriors, while purifying areas contaminated by chaos corruption through her mere proximity. These abilities demonstrate the comprehensive nature of divine intervention associated with living saints, affecting not only the saint personally, but entire battlefields and campaigns. The veneration of martyrs within Imperial religious practice reflects the theological principle that willing sacrifice for the Emperor's cause represents the highest expression of human devotion. The Church developed extensive liturgies and observances that honored individuals who died defending Imperial worlds, protecting civilian populations, or maintaining religious orthodoxy in the face of persecution. These martyrs provided spiritual examples for ordinary believers, while demonstrating that death in service to the Emperor guaranteed eternal reward rather than mere extinction. The cult of martyrdom became a central element of Imperial religious culture, inspiring countless acts of heroism and sacrifice throughout the galaxy. The process of identifying and venerating martyrs required careful investigation to distinguish between individuals who died through genuine devotion and those who perished through accident, incompetence, or other circumstances unrelated to religious commitment. Local clergy compiled detailed accounts of martyrs' final actions, gathering testimony from witnesses who could confirm that their deaths resulted from conscious choice to serve the Emperor rather than mere misfortune. The most revered martyrs were those who faced clear opportunities to save their lives through betrayal or abandonment of duty, but chose death rather than compromise their faith or abandon their responsibilities. The shrine worlds that emerged throughout Imperial space provided focal points for the veneration of saints and martyrs, while serving practical functions as pilgrimage destinations and centers of religious learning. These worlds typically developed around sites associated with particular saints or significant religious events, creating sacred geography that reinforced Imperial religious beliefs through physical pilgrimage. The shrine world of San Lear preserved the remains of Saint Lear within a massive cathedral complex that attracted millions of pilgrims annually, while the shrine world of Dimammer honored Sebastian, Thor's birthplace, through elaborate religious observances and educational institutions. The development of shrine worlds required massive resource investment to create infrastructure capable of supporting millions of pilgrims while maintaining appropriate religious atmosphere. Cathedral complexes on these worlds rivaled the greatest architectural achievements in Imperial history, featuring soaring spires that reached toward the heavens while providing vast interior spaces for religious observance. The construction projects often lasted for centuries as successive generations of builders added new elements to honor additional saints or commemorate important religious events. The finished complexes served not only as worship spaces, but as museums, libraries, and educational centers that preserved religious knowledge and artifacts for future generations. Pilgrimage routes connecting shrine worlds created networks of religious travel that bound Imperial space together through shared spiritual experience. The most devout believers saved throughout their lifetimes for journeys that might span multiple sectors and require years to complete. These pilgrimages provided opportunities for spiritual growth and religious education, while creating economic networks that supported countless communities along major pilgrimage routes. The ships that carried pilgrims developed their own religious traditions, with shipboard chapels and regular prayer services that maintained spiritual focus during the long void journeys between sacred destinations. The relics associated with Imperial saints became objects of intense veneration that were believed to retain miraculous properties derived from their connection to holy individuals. These artifacts ranged from personal possessions used by saints during their lifetimes to fragments of their remains preserved after death. The most powerful relics reportedly demonstrated continuing miraculous effects, healing the faithful who approached them with proper devotion, while providing protection against chaos corruption and other spiritual threats. The authentication and preservation of genuine relics required sophisticated procedures to prevent fraud, while ensuring that sacred objects received appropriate reverence and protection. The trade in religious relics created both opportunities for genuine spiritual enrichment and temptations for fraud that required constant vigilance from ecclesiastical authorities. Unscrupulous merchants attempted to sell false relics to gullible pilgrims, while heretical cults sometimes created corrupted artifacts designed to spread spiritual contamination among the faithful. The Church developed specialized expertise in evaluating claimed relics, using both theological knowledge and practical investigation techniques to distinguish genuine sacred objects from clever forgeries. The most important relics received elaborate protective measures, including specially trained guards and advanced security systems that rivaled those protecting major Imperial military installations. The theological framework surrounding relic veneration required careful balance between acknowledging their spiritual significance and avoiding the idolatry that had characterized pre-Imperial religious traditions. Orthodox doctrine established that relics derived their power from their connection to saints who served as conduits for the emperor's divine will, making veneration of relics ultimately a form of worship directed toward the Golden Throne. This interpretation allowed the Church to encourage popular devotion to relics while maintaining doctrinal consistency with imperial monotheism. The proper use of relics required appropriate spiritual preparation and orthodox understanding of their significance within the broader framework of imperial faith. The preservation and display of relics within cathedral complexes created sacred spaces that reinforced religious devotion through carefully designed sensory experiences. The reliquaries that housed the most important artifacts combined advanced preservation technology with artistic elements that emphasized their spiritual significance. Precious metals, rare gems, and intricate craftsmanship transformed simple personal objects into magnificent displays that inspired awe and reverence among viewers. The lighting, acoustics, and spatial arrangement of relic displays created atmospheric effects that enhanced the spiritual impact of pilgrimage, while demonstrating the Church's commitment to honoring the emperor's chosen servants. The veneration of saints and martyrs through relics and pilgrimage provided the spiritual framework for imperial religious life, but the daily expression of faith required structured observances that could unite billions of believers across countless worlds in common devotion. The development of standardized religious practices represented one of the Adeptus Ministerum's greatest achievements, creating liturgical traditions that could adapt to local customs while maintaining essential theological unity. These rituals transformed the abstract concept of imperial faith into tangible experiences that shaped the rhythm of daily life throughout the galaxy, binding together populations separated by vast distances through shared acts of worship and devotion. The morning prayers that began each day across imperial worlds followed patterns established during Sebastian Thor's reforms, though local variations reflected the diverse cultural traditions found throughout human space. The standard liturgy commenced before dawn with the invocation of the Golden Dawn, a series of prayers that acknowledged the emperor's protection during the hours of darkness while requesting his blessing for the coming day. Citizens gathered in parish churches, workplace chapels, or private homes to recite these ancient words, their voices joining in unison as they faced toward Terra and the distant Golden Throne. The prayers emphasized humanity's dependence upon divine protection in a hostile galaxy, while expressing gratitude for the Emperor's continued vigilance over his chosen people. The Litany of Awakening followed the opening invocation, consisting of responsive prayers between clergy and congregation that rehearsed fundamental imperial doctrines. These exchanges reinforced core beliefs about the Emperor's divinity, humanity's special status, and the constant threats posed by heretics, mutants, and aliens. The congregation's responses grew in volume and intensity as the litany progressed, creating a communal expression of faith that strengthened individual resolve while demonstrating collective devotion. Local variations in the litany incorporated regional saints and historical events, allowing communities to connect their particular circumstances with broader imperial religious traditions. Work hymns accompanied the daily labor that sustained imperial civilization, transforming mundane tasks into expressions of religious devotion through sacred music and prayer. These hymns varied dramatically based on the type of work being performed, with agricultural worlds developing songs that celebrated the emperor's blessing upon crops and harvests, while industrial planets created rhythmic chants that synchronized with the operation of massive manufacturing equipment. The hymns served practical purposes beyond religious expression, helping workers maintain proper pace and coordination during complex tasks, while reinforcing the spiritual significance of their contributions to imperial society. The forge hymns of industrial worlds demonstrated the sophisticated integration of religious observance with technological production that characterized imperial manufacturing. Workers operating plasma furnaces and assembly lines chanted prayers that requested the emperor's blessing upon their machinery, while asking for protection against the mechanical failures that could prove catastrophic in heavy industrial environments. These hymns incorporated technical terminology and production schedules into their sacred verses, creating unique liturgical forms that celebrated both divine authority and human craftsmanship. The rhythmic chanting helped workers maintain concentration during repetitive tasks, while fostering the sense of sacred purpose that elevated manual labor beyond mere economic necessity. Agricultural hymns reflected the seasonal cycles that governed farming communities throughout imperial space, with different songs marking planting, cultivation, and harvest periods. These hymns acknowledged the emperor's control over weather patterns and growing conditions, while expressing gratitude for fertile soil and adequate rainfall. The singing often accompanied collective work activities such as planting or harvesting, creating communal experiences that reinforced social bonds while celebrating the divine provision that sustained human life. Regional variations incorporated local agricultural practices and crop types, demonstrating how universal imperial themes could adapt to specific environmental conditions. Mining hymns addressed the particular dangers faced by workers extracting resources from hostile planetary environments, requesting divine protection against cave-ins, toxic gases, and other hazards common in extractive industries. These songs often honored the memory of workers who had died in industrial accidents, treating their sacrifice as a form of martyrdom that contributed to the greater imperial cause. The hymns emphasized the spiritual significance of the materials being extracted, whether promethium for imperial vehicles or rare metals for advanced technology, connecting individual labor with the broader military and civilian needs of imperial society. Evening benedictions concluded each day with prayers that expressed gratitude for divine protection, while requesting continued blessing during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The sunset litany acknowledged the symbolic significance of darkness as a time when chaos forces gain strength, making the emperor's protection particularly crucial for faithful believers. Communities gathered in churches or public squares to participate in these collective prayers, their voices rising together as the sun disappeared and artificial lighting illuminated their gathering places. The benedictions included specific prayers for the safety of family members, the success of imperial military operations, and the continued stability of local governmental institutions. The Vigil of Eternal Watch formed a central component of evening observances, acknowledging the emperor's sleepless guardianship over humanity from his position upon the Golden Throne. This prayer cycle reminded believers that while they rested, the emperor remained alert to threats that might emerge during the night hours. The vigil included specific prayers for imperial forces engaged in combat operations across the galaxy, recognizing that military actions often occurred during hours when civilian populations slept peacefully under divine protection. Local variations incorporated prayers for specific regiments or naval fleets that included personnel from the community, creating personal connections between individual believers and the broader imperial military effort. The prayer of peaceful rest requested the emperor's blessing upon sleep, while asking for protection against nightmares and spiritual corruption that might infiltrate dreams. This prayer reflected theological understanding that sleep represented a vulnerable state when the human mind might become susceptible to chaos influence or heretical thoughts. The prayer included specific invocations against demonic intrusion and requests for prophetic dreams that might provide divine guidance for important decisions. Parents often recited these prayers over sleeping children, creating family traditions that reinforced religious devotion while providing comfort during the uncertain hours of darkness. Major holy days throughout the imperial calendar created opportunities for elaborate celebrations that reinforced religious unity while providing respite from the grinding demands of daily labor. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension commemorated the moment when the Emperor achieved his current divine state upon the Golden Throne, marking the transformation from mortal leader to eternal guardian of humanity. This most important religious holiday required extensive preparation as communities organized processions, special meals, and charitable activities that demonstrated their devotion while celebrating the divine protection that sustained imperial civilization. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension began with dawn ceremonies that reenacted the emperor's sacrifice during his confrontation with Horus, using dramatic presentations and sacred music to help believers understand the theological significance of that pivotal moment. These performances required careful theological oversight to ensure accuracy while avoiding any glorification of the War Master's betrayal. The presentations emphasized the emperor's willing sacrifice of his mortal form to achieve the divine state necessary for protecting humanity throughout eternity, demonstrating how individual sacrifice could serve the greater good of imperial society. Charitable activities during the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension reflected the theological principle that divine blessing carried obligations to care for less fortunate members of the community. Wealthy citizens organized food distributions for the poor, while guilds and other organizations sponsored medical care for those unable to afford treatment. These activities demonstrated practical expressions of faith while creating opportunities for different social classes to interact in constructive ways. The charitable work was understood as a form of prayer in action, showing devotion through deeds rather than mere words. Emperor's Day celebrated the anniversary of the emperor's birth, though the actual date remained lost in the mists of ancient history. The church selected a date that coincided with the winter solstice on Terra, symbolically connecting the emperor's arrival with the return of light after the year's darkest period. This holiday emphasized hope and renewal, encouraging believers to recommit themselves to faithful service while celebrating the divine love that motivated the emperor's protection of humanity. The celebrations typically included the lighting of ceremonial flames that represented the emperor's light dispelling the darkness of ignorance and heresy. Emperor's Day observances featured the renewal of oath ceremony, where imperial citizens publicly reaffirmed their loyalty to the Golden Throne and their commitment to living according to imperial religious principles. These ceremonies provided opportunities for individuals to confess past failures while resolving to demonstrate greater devotion in the coming year. The public nature of the oath-taking created community accountability while reinforcing the social bonds that held imperial society together. Local variations incorporated specific regional concerns and challenges, allowing communities to address particular issues while maintaining connection with universal imperial themes. The Festival of the Martyred honored the memory of saints and heroes who had died in service to the emperor, providing opportunities for communities to celebrate their own local martyrs, while acknowledging the broader tradition of sacrifice that sustained imperial civilization. These observances typically featured readings from the lives of saints, musical performances that celebrated heroic deeds, and ceremonial displays of relics associated with martyred individuals. The festivals emphasized that death in service to the emperor represented victory rather than defeat, encouraging believers to view their own potential sacrifice as meaningful contributions to humanity's eternal struggle against darkness. Regional variations in Festival of the Martyred celebrations reflected local military traditions and historical events that shaped particular communities' understanding of heroism and sacrifice. Worlds that had experienced major battles often incorporated reenactments of crucial military actions, while communities with strong Space Marine connections might emphasize the heroic deeds of particular chapters or individual warriors. These local elements enhance the personal relevance of the celebrations while maintaining connection with broader Imperial religious themes. Sacramental observances marked crucial transitions in individual lives, providing religious framework for understanding personal development within the context of Imperial society. Birth blessings welcomed new children into the community of faith while requesting divine protection during the vulnerable early years of life. These ceremonies typically occurred within the first few weeks after birth, giving parents time to recover from delivery while ensuring that children received religious recognition before they became too exposed to potential corruption. The blessings included prayers for physical health, spiritual purity, and eventual service to the emperor in whatever capacity their talents and circumstances might allow. The rite of naming formed a central component of birth blessings, formally establishing the child's identity within Imperial society while invoking divine protection over their future development. Parents selected names that honored Imperial saints, historical heroes, or family traditions, with clergy providing guidance to ensure appropriate choices that reflected proper religious understanding. The ceremony included prayers that the child would grow to demonstrate the virtues associated with their chosen name, while avoiding the failures or weaknesses that might have characterized historical figures. Local variations incorporated regional naming traditions and cultural practices that had been adapted to Imperial religious requirements. Consecration of purpose ceremonies marked the transition from childhood to adult responsibility, typically occurring during adolescence when young people demonstrated readiness to assume their roles within Imperial society. These rites varied significantly based on the individual's intended career path, with different ceremonies for those entering military service, civilian occupations, or religious vocations. The consecrations included prayers for divine guidance in fulfilling adult responsibilities, while requesting protection against the temptations and challenges that characterized mature life in Imperial society. Military consecrations emphasized the sacred nature of armed service in defense of the Emperor's realm, treating enlistment as a form of religious calling rather than mere career choice. Young people entering Imperial Guard regiments, planetary defense forces, or other military organizations received special blessings that requested divine protection during combat while emphasizing their role as instruments of the Emperor's will. These ceremonies often included the presentation of blessed weapons or armor that would accompany the new soldiers throughout their service, creating tangible connections between religious devotion and military effectiveness. Civilian consecrations acknowledged that all honest labor served the Emperor's purposes, whether in agriculture, manufacturing, administration, or other essential occupations. These ceremonies emphasized the spiritual significance of contributing to Imperial society through productive work while requesting divine blessing upon the individual's efforts. The rites included prayers for professional success, ethical conduct, and the wisdom necessary for making decisions that served both personal needs and broader Imperial interests. Marriage ceremonies united couples within the framework of Imperial religious understanding, emphasizing the sacred nature of family bonds while acknowledging the practical requirements for maintaining stable communities. These rites included extensive prayers for divine blessing upon the union, while establishing religious obligations for both partners to support each other's spiritual development. The ceremonies incorporated local cultural traditions that had been adapted to Imperial religious requirements, allowing communities to maintain distinctive customs while ensuring theological orthodoxy. The exchange of sacred vows formed the central element of Imperial marriage ceremonies, with couples making public commitments to support each other's service to the Emperor, while promising to raise any children according to orthodox religious principles. These vows emphasized mutual responsibility for spiritual welfare rather than mere personal happiness, reflecting Imperial understanding that individual fulfillment should serve broader social purposes. The public nature of the vow exchange created community accountability for the success of the marriage, while demonstrating the couple's commitment to living according to imperial values. Final rites prepared the dying for their transition from earthly service to eternal rest, providing religious framework for understanding death as completion rather than defeat. These ceremonies varied based on the circumstances of death, with different observances for those dying peacefully in old age versus those killed in military service or industrial accidents. The rites emphasized the emperor's mercy toward faithful servants while requesting divine judgment that would recognize the individual's contributions to imperial society. Family members and community leaders participated in these ceremonies, creating collective experiences that reinforced social bonds while providing comfort during times of grief. The preparation for the emperor's peace involved extensive prayers and ritual purification designed to cleanse the dying person of any spiritual contamination they might have accumulated during their lifetime. These preparations included confession of failures and mistakes, formal forgiveness from community members who might have been wronged, and final expressions of faith that demonstrated continued devotion despite approaching death. The ceremonies provided opportunities for resolving conflicts and strengthening relationships before they were severed by death, creating peaceful transitions that honored both the dying individual and the community they were leaving behind. Memorial observances following death celebrated the deceased individual's contributions to imperial society while requesting divine mercy for any shortcomings that might affect their eternal fate. These ceremonies typically featured readings from the person's life achievements, testimonials from family and community members, and prayers that their example would inspire continued devotion among survivors. The observances emphasized continuity between the living and dead, treating death as transition rather than termination, while encouraging survivors to honor the deceased through their own faithful service. Regional variations in religious practice reflected the enormous cultural diversity found throughout imperial space, as local traditions adapted to imperial religious requirements while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected particular historical experiences and environmental conditions. Desert worlds developed ceremonies that acknowledged water as a sacred gift from the emperor, while ice planets created rituals that celebrated the spiritual significance of surviving in hostile environments. These variations demonstrated the flexibility of imperial religious practice while maintaining essential theological unity across vast distances and diverse populations. Ocean worlds developed unique baptismal traditions that incorporated the symbolic significance of water as both life-giving and purifying, creating elaborate ceremonies that took place in natural bodies of water rather than artificial fonts. These rituals emphasized the emperor's control over planetary environments while acknowledging the particular challenges faced by maritime communities. The ceremonies often included prayers for safe voyages and protection against the sea creatures that posed threats to fishing and transportation activities. Mountain communities created observances that emphasized the spiritual significance of elevation, treating high places as closer to the emperor's divine presence, while acknowledging the physical challenges of life in harsh terrain. These ceremonies often involved pilgrimages to mountain peaks, where communities built shrines and conducted special prayers during important religious holidays. The physical difficulty of reaching these elevated sites enhanced the spiritual significance of the observances, while demonstrating the community's willingness to make sacrifices in service to their faith. Underground communities, whether in natural cave systems or artificial mining complexes, developed rituals that addressed the psychological challenges of life away from natural sunlight and open spaces. These ceremonies emphasized the emperor's presence even in the deepest underground locations, while providing spiritual comfort for populations that might otherwise feel isolated from the broader imperial community. The observances often included the use of artificial lighting to symbolize divine illumination, penetrating even the darkest places where faithful believers maintain their devotion. The incorporation of local traditions into imperial religious observance required careful theological oversight to ensure that regional practices enhanced rather than compromised orthodox doctrine. Local clergy worked closely with visiting ecclesiastical authorities to evaluate proposed adaptations, ensuring that cultural elements served legitimate religious purposes rather than preserving pre-imperial beliefs that might conflict with proper devotion to the emperor. This process created ongoing dialogue between local communities and higher church authorities, fostering mutual understanding while maintaining doctrinal consistency across the vast expanse of imperial space. The standardization of religious practices across imperial space required not merely common rituals and observances, but authoritative texts that could provide theological foundation for faith while serving as practical guides for clergy and believers alike. The development of imperial sacred literature represented one of the most complex challenges facing the emerging Adeptus Ministorum, as the Church needed to create comprehensive doctrinal works that could address the spiritual needs of countless diverse populations while maintaining absolute theological consistency. The process involved careful compilation of existing religious writings, extensive theological analysis of competing interpretations, and the gradual emergence of canonical texts that would define imperial faith for millennia to come. The Lectitio Divinitatis stands as the foundational theological work of the imperial cult, though its origins remain shrouded in both historical complexity and deliberate ecclesiastical obscurity. Tradition attributes authorship to Lorgar Aurelian, the primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, during his period of spiritual searching that preceded his fall to chaos corruption. This attribution creates profound theological difficulties for imperial scholars, as it suggests that the most sacred text of imperial faith emerged from the pen of one who would later become among the emperor's greatest enemies. The Church has addressed this paradox through sophisticated theological arguments that distinguish between the divine inspiration that guided the text's creation and the personal failings of its mortal author. The historical circumstances surrounding the Lectitio Divinitatis reflect the complex spiritual journey that Lorgar underwent during the Great Crusade's early decades. The word-bearers had distinguished themselves through their zealous prosecution of compliance campaigns, but their tendency to establish elaborate religious ceremonies honoring the emperor drew criticism from their Gene Father and other imperial authorities committed to the imperial truth. The emperor's personal rebuke of Lorgar at Monarchia, where he forced the word-bearers to kneel before the ruins of their greatest religious monument, created a spiritual crisis that drove the Primarch to seek deeper understanding of humanity's relationship with transcendent powers. Lorgar's pilgrimage to Cadia and his subsequent encounters with chaos-corrupted sources provided him with knowledge about the warp's true nature, but the Lectitio Divinitatis appears to have been written during an earlier period when his spiritual insights remained untainted by heretical influence. The text demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the emperor's divine nature and humanity's special relationship with transcendent authority, suggesting that Lorgar's initial religious instincts contained genuine spiritual truth despite his later corruption. Church scholars argue that the emperor's divine will work through Lorgar during this period, using the Primarch's exceptional theological abilities to create the foundational text that would guide imperial faith throughout subsequent millennia. The theological content of the Lectitio Divinitatis establishes the fundamental doctrines that define orthodox imperial belief, presenting systematic arguments for the emperor's divinity while addressing potential objections and alternative interpretations. The text begins with extensive analysis of the emperor's extraordinary abilities and achievements, demonstrating that his powers transcend anything achievable through purely mortal effort or advanced technology. Lorgar's arguments draw upon historical evidence from the Great Crusade, citing specific instances of miraculous intervention and prophetic knowledge that could only result from divine omniscience and omnipotence. The work's treatment of the emperor's relationship to humanity emphasizes both his divine transcendence and his special concern for human welfare, establishing theological frameworks that would prove essential for later imperial doctrine. Lorgar argues that the emperor's divine nature does not separate him from humanity, but rather represents the fulfillment of human potential under divine guidance. This interpretation provides religious justification for imperial expansion, while maintaining that the emperor's authority derives from his role as humanity's divine protector rather than mere political dominance. The Lectitio Divinitatis addresses the complex question of the emperor's apparent rejection of worship during the Great Crusade through sophisticated theological analysis that would later influence official church doctrine. Lorger argues that the emperor's denial of his divine nature represented a form of divine humility designed to prevent premature revelation that might have attracted dangerous attention from chaos powers before humanity was spiritually prepared to resist their influence. This interpretation allows the text to acknowledge historical reality while maintaining that the emperor's divinity was always genuine and would eventually require appropriate recognition and worship. The text's discussion of human destiny under divine guidance establishes many of the theological foundations for imperial expansion and the subjugation of alien species. Lorger presents detailed arguments that humanity represents the emperor's chosen people, destined to inherit dominion over the galaxy through divine favor and righteous conquest. These passages provide religious justification for the aggressive military campaigns that characterize imperial policy, while emphasizing that conquest must serve spiritual purposes rather than mere secular ambition. The Lectitio Divinitatis also addresses the nature of evil and corruption in the galaxy, though Lorger's understanding of chaos remained limited during the period of composition. The text identifies various forms of spiritual contamination that threaten human purity, while emphasizing the emperor's role as humanity's protector against such dangers. These passages demonstrate remarkable prescience regarding threats that would later prove central to imperial survival, suggesting that divine inspiration guided Lorger's insights even when his conscious understanding remained incomplete. The preservation and dissemination of the Lectitio Divinitatis during the Horus Heresy required extraordinary efforts by faithful imperial citizens who recognized the text's spiritual value despite its controversial authorship. Copies of the work survived the destruction of Monarchia and the subsequent persecution of religious believers who maintained devotion to the emperor's divine nature. Underground networks of believers preserved manuscript copies while adding their own theological commentaries and practical applications that enhanced the text's relevance for communities struggling to maintain faith during the galaxy's darkest period. The formal adoption of the Lectitio Divinitatis as canonical scripture occurred gradually as the imperial cult developed institutional structure and theological authority. Early church leaders recognized the text's exceptional theological sophistication while acknowledging the difficulties created by Lorger's later heresy. The solution involved extensive editorial work that preserved the text's essential theological content, while adding commentary that clarified orthodox interpretations and warned against potential misunderstandings that might lead toward heretical conclusions. Sebastian Thor's reforms during the Age of Apostasy included comprehensive review of the Lectitio Divinitatis and other foundational texts, ensuring that canonical scripture supported orthodox doctrine while providing practical guidance for clergy and believers. This process involved consultation with the most learned theologians throughout imperial space, creating scholarly consensus regarding proper interpretation of potentially ambiguous passages. The resulting canonical version became the standard text used in theological education and religious instruction throughout the Imperium. The Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer represents a very different approach to religious instruction, combining military doctrine with spiritual guidance in a format designed for mass distribution among Imperial Guard forces. This practical manual addresses the immediate spiritual needs of soldiers facing combat against heretical and Xenos enemies, while providing basic theological education for personnel who might lack extensive religious background. The primer's development reflected recognition that military effectiveness required not only tactical training, but also spiritual preparation for the psychological challenges of warfare in the 41st millennium. The theological content of the uplifting primer emphasizes practical applications of imperial faith rather than sophisticated doctrinal analysis, presenting religious concepts in language accessible to soldiers with limited formal education. The text includes basic prayers appropriate for various combat situations, from pre-battle invocations requesting divine protection to final rites for dying comrades. These prayers combine requests for practical assistance with expressions of faith that reinforce the spiritual significance of military service in defense of the Emperor's realm. The primer's treatment of enemy forces provides religious framework for understanding the various threats that Imperial Guard regiments encounter throughout the galaxy. Sections on heretical cults emphasize the spiritual corruption that motivates rebellion against Imperial authority, while providing practical guidance for recognizing and countering heretical propaganda. The text's discussion of alien enemies combines tactical information with theological explanations of why cooperation with Xeno's species represents betrayal of humanity's divine calling. Combat doctrine within the uplifting primer incorporates religious elements that enhance military effectiveness while maintaining spiritual focus during the stress of battle. The text provides guidance for conducting field religious services under combat conditions, including abbreviated liturgies that can be completed quickly in dangerous environments. Instructions for battlefield chaplains emphasize the importance of maintaining morale through spiritual leadership, while ensuring that religious observance does not compromise operational security or tactical effectiveness. The primer includes extensive sections on recognizing and resisting chaos corruption, providing practical guidance that could prove essential for Imperial Guard personnel exposed to heretical influence during anti-rebellion campaigns. These passages describe the subtle signs of spiritual contamination, while emphasizing the importance of maintaining faith as protection against psychological warfare employed by chaos cultists. The text provides specific prayers and mental exercises designed to strengthen resistance to corruption, while encouraging soldiers to report suspected heretical influence among their comrades. Disciplinary guidance within the uplifting primer combines military regulations with religious instruction, emphasizing that proper conduct serves both tactical effectiveness and spiritual purity. The text addresses common disciplinary problems such as desertion, insubordination, and cowardice through religious frameworks that emphasize duty to the Emperor rather than mere obedience to human authority. This approach enhances the moral authority of military discipline while providing soldiers with spiritual motivation for maintaining proper conduct even under extreme stress. The mass production and distribution of the uplifting primer required extensive cooperation between the Adeptus Ministorum and Imperial military institutions, creating standardized religious education for millions of soldiers throughout Imperial space. The text underwent regular revision to incorporate lessons learned from recent campaigns while maintaining essential theological content that provided spiritual foundation for military service. Regional variations addressed specific threats and challenges encountered in different theaters of operation, while preserving universal Imperial themes that unified military forces across vast distances. Training programs for Imperial Guard chaplains incorporated extensive study of the uplifting primer alongside more sophisticated theological works, ensuring that military clergy could provide appropriate spiritual guidance while understanding the practical constraints of combat environments. These programs emphasize the importance of adapting religious instruction to the immediate needs of soldiers facing life-threatening situations, while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy that supported broader Imperial religious unity. The development of apocryphal texts created ongoing challenges for ecclesiastical authorities tasked with distinguishing between legitimate religious writings and potentially dangerous works that might contain heretical elements or factual errors. These unofficial religious works emerged from various sources throughout Imperial space, including local clergy who sought to address specific pastoral needs, scholars who developed new theological interpretations, and individuals claiming direct divine revelation. The evaluation of such texts required sophisticated theological analysis combined with practical assessment of their potential impact on religious unity and doctrinal consistency. Local religious traditions often produced apocryphal works that incorporated regional cultural elements into imperial religious frameworks, creating texts that served legitimate pastoral purposes while potentially conflicting with standardized doctrine. These works might include prayers adapted to local environmental conditions, theological interpretations that addressed specific historical experiences, or devotional practices that reflected distinctive cultural traditions. The Church needed to evaluate such texts carefully, distinguishing between acceptable adaptations that enhanced religious relevance and dangerous innovations that might undermine doctrinal unity. Prophetic writings represented particularly challenging categories of apocryphal texts, as individuals throughout imperial space claimed to receive divine visions that provided new religious insights or warnings about future events. The evaluation of such claims required careful investigation of the alleged prophet's character and orthodoxy, analysis of the claimed revelations for consistency with established doctrine, and practical assessment of whether the prophecies served legitimate religious purposes or promoted dangerous innovations. The Church developed standardized procedures for investigating prophetic claims while maintaining openness to genuine divine communication. Scholarly theological works produced by learned clergy and academic institutions created another category of apocryphal texts that required careful evaluation. These works might include detailed commentaries on canonical scripture, systematic analyses of particular doctrinal questions, or comparative studies of regional religious variations. While such texts could provide valuable resources for theological education and pastoral care, they also risked promoting interpretations that conflicted with official doctrine or creating confusion among believers who lacked the theological training necessary for evaluating complex arguments. The identification of genuinely dangerous apocryphal texts required cooperation between ecclesiastical authorities and the Ordo Hereticus, as some unofficial religious works contained subtle heretical elements designed to gradually corrupt orthodox belief. These texts might appear superficially orthodox while promoting interpretations that slowly led readers toward heretical conclusions, or they might contain coded messages designed to communicate with existing heretical movements. The investigation of such texts required both theological expertise and investigative skills that could identify hidden dangers while avoiding suppression of legitimate religious expression. Forbidden knowledge represented the most dangerous category of religious texts, including works that contained information about chaos, corruption, alien religious practices, or other subjects that posed direct threats to spiritual purity. These texts might have been created by heretical cults seeking to spread their corruption, captured from enemy forces during military campaigns, or discovered in ancient archives that predated imperial compliance. The handling of such materials required extreme caution and specialized training to prevent accidental corruption of investigators, while ensuring that dangerous information did not spread throughout imperial society. The Ordo Malleus maintained specialized libraries containing forbidden texts that provided essential intelligence about chaos threats, while remaining accessible only to individuals with appropriate authorization and spiritual protection. These collections included captured cult writings, demon-possessed artifacts, and other materials that could provide crucial insights into enemy capabilities and intentions. The maintenance of such collections required extraordinary security measures and regular spiritual purification of personnel who worked with potentially corrupting materials. Theological debates within the ecclesiarchy created ongoing discussions about proper interpretation of canonical texts and appropriate responses to new challenges facing imperial faith. These debates typically occurred within formal ecclesiastical institutions, such as the Holy Synod or regional church councils, where learned clergy could engage in detailed analysis of complex doctrinal questions while maintaining appropriate respect for established authority. The debates served important functions in developing church policy and providing guidance for local clergy who encountered unusual pastoral situations. Doctrinal controversies often emerged from practical challenges that required new theological interpretations or applications of established principles to unprecedented situations. The discovery of new alien species might require theological analysis of their relationship to humanity's divine calling, while the emergence of new forms of heretical corruption might demand updated understanding of spiritual contamination and appropriate countermeasures. These debates involved extensive consultation of canonical texts and historical precedents, while remaining open to genuine insights that might enhance understanding of divine will. The resolution of theological debates typically involved hierarchical processes that balanced scholarly analysis with ecclesiastical authority, ensuring that new doctrinal developments served the broader interests of imperial faith while maintaining consistency with established tradition. Senior clergy possessed authority to establish binding interpretations of disputed questions, though such decisions usually reflected extensive consultation and careful consideration of various perspectives. The formal adoption of new doctrinal positions required approval from appropriate ecclesiastical authorities and integration into official teaching materials used throughout imperial space. The orders Dialogus emerged as specialized institutions within the Adeptus sororitas, dedicated to preserving, interpreting, and disseminating sacred texts throughout the Imperium. These scholarly orders combine the martial dedication, characteristic of the sisterhood, with exceptional intellectual abilities and deep theological knowledge necessary for managing the vast corpus of imperial religious literature. Members of the orders Dialogus received extensive training in linguistics, theology, history, and textual analysis that enabled them to serve as the Imperium's premier religious scholars and interpreters of sacred tradition. The preservation activities of the orders Dialogus involved maintaining vast libraries and scriptoriums, where canonical texts and approved commentaries were copied, stored, and protected against the various threats that might destroy precious religious materials. These institutions employed advanced preservation techniques that could maintain manuscript integrity across millennia, while creating multiple copies that ensured survival, even if individual libraries suffered destruction. The scriptoriums also served as training centers, where new generations of scribes learned the specialized skills necessary for accurate copying of religious texts. Textual analysis conducted by the orders Dialogus included detailed examination of manuscript variations, historical development of particular doctrinal interpretations, and comparative study of regional religious traditions that might provide insights into proper understanding of canonical works. This scholarly work required exceptional attention to detail, combined with sophisticated understanding of theological principles that could distinguish between meaningful variations and scribal errors. The results of such analysis informed official church positions on disputed interpretations while providing resources for advanced theological education. The translation work performed by the orders Dialogus enabled the dissemination of canonical texts throughout imperial space, despite the enormous linguistic diversity found across human worlds. Sisters Dialogus mastered multiple languages while developing deep understanding of cultural contexts that affected translation accuracy and effectiveness. Their work involved not merely converting words from one language to another, but ensuring that theological concepts retain their proper meaning, despite significant cultural differences between source and target populations. Distribution networks maintained by the orders Dialogus ensured that canonical texts and approved religious materials reached even the most remote imperial worlds, creating galaxy-spanning systems for sharing religious knowledge and maintaining doctrinal unity. These networks coordinated with other imperial institutions, including the Adeptus Administratum and Imperial Navy, to transport religious materials alongside other essential supplies. The Sisters Dialogus also trained local clergy in proper textual interpretation and teaching methods that could effectively communicate complex theological concepts to diverse populations. The educational programs developed by the Order's Dialogus provided comprehensive theological training for clergy throughout imperial space, but the catastrophic events of the 42nd millennium would test every aspect of this carefully constructed religious infrastructure beyond its design limits. The Great Rift's violent birth across the galaxy fundamentally altered the spiritual landscape of the Imperium, creating challenges that no amount of theological preparation could fully address. The massive warp storm, known to Imperial scholars as the Cicatrix Maledictum, did not merely divide the galaxy into two distinct regions. It transformed the very nature of religious experience for billions of Imperial citizens who found themselves living under skies that blazed with unnatural energies and witnessed phenomena that defied millennia of established doctrine. The Cicatrix Maledictum's formation during the 13th Black Crusade created immediate theological crises as Imperial worlds experienced direct exposure to warp energies on scales previously unimaginable. Planets that had maintained stable religious practices for thousands of years suddenly faced demonic manifestations in broad daylight, while faithful citizens who had never questioned orthodox doctrine found themselves experiencing visions and supernatural encounters that challenged their understanding of reality. Local clergy, trained to address conventional pastoral concerns, struggled to provide guidance for populations confronting literal manifestations of the Imperium within their daily lives. The psychological impact on Imperial populations proved as devastating as the physical destruction wrought by the Great Rift's formation. Citizens who had lived their entire lives believing that proper faith provided protection against chaos corruption discovered that even the most devout believers could witness demonic entities materializing in their midst. The traditional comfort provided by religious observance seemed inadequate when morning prayers were interrupted by reality tears that allowed glimpses into the warp's chaotic depths. Established liturgies that had sustained faith for millennia appeared insufficient when confronted with supernatural phenomena that exceeded anything described in canonical texts. Ecclesiastical authorities faced unprecedented challenges in maintaining doctrinal consistency when the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial theology were being tested by daily experience. The Church had long taught that the Emperor's protection shielded the faithful from direct chaos influence, yet entire cathedral cities found themselves besieged by demonic forces that manifested without warning. Traditional explanations for supernatural phenomena proved inadequate when confronted with warp storms that persisted for months and psychic anomalies that affected entire planetary populations simultaneously. The Adeptus Ministerum's response to these challenges required rapid adaptation of theological frameworks that could address new realities without abandoning the fundamental principles that defined imperial faith. Senior clergy worked frantically to develop new interpretations of established doctrine that could explain the Great Rift's effects, while maintaining the Emperor's supreme authority and humanity's special status. These theological innovations emphasized that the current crisis represented a test of faith rather than evidence of divine abandonment, arguing that the Emperor's protection remained absolute even when its manifestations became less immediately apparent. Regional variations in religious response to the Cicatrix Maledictum reflected the diverse ways different imperial populations experienced the Great Rift's effects. Worlds located near the storm's edge developed new liturgies that incorporated prayers for protection against warp intrusion, while populations in the galaxy's divided halves created distinct theological traditions that reflected their isolation from Terra and the broader imperial community. These adaptations demonstrated the flexibility that had always characterized imperial religious practice, but they also created potential for doctrinal fragmentation that threatened the unity the Church had spent millennia building. The return of Robute Guilliman to active leadership within the Imperium created complex tensions between the Primarch's secular perspective and the thoroughly religious society that had developed during his 10,000-year absence. Guilliman's awakening from his death-like state represented a miraculous event that validated Imperial beliefs about divine intervention, yet his obvious discomfort with the religious devotion directed toward his person created awkward situations for ecclesiastical authorities who had incorporated Primarch veneration into standard doctrine. The Primarch's pragmatic approach to governance often conflicted with religious considerations that had become integral to Imperial decision-making processes. Guilliman's initial encounters with the modern ecclesiarchy revealed the vast gulf that had developed between the secular Imperial society he remembered and the thoroughly theocratic civilization that had emerged in his absence. The Primarch expressed private dismay at the transformation of his father's rational vision into what he perceived as superstitious dogma, yet he recognized the practical necessity of working within existing religious frameworks rather than attempting to restore the discredited Imperial truth. His public statements carefully balanced respect for established religious traditions with subtle encouragement of more rational approaches to problem solving. The Lord Commander's relationship with Ecclesiarch Desis VI exemplified the delicate negotiations required between secular and religious authority in the new Imperial hierarchy. Desis, representing centuries of ecclesiastical tradition and institutional authority, found himself dealing with a figure whose theoretical religious significance exceeded his own, yet whose practical approach to governance often challenged established church positions. The two leaders developed a working relationship that preserved ecclesiastical independence while ensuring that religious considerations did not impede essential military and administrative reforms. Guilliman's Indomitus crusade created practical challenges for the Adeptus Ministorum, as massive military expeditions required unprecedented coordination between secular and religious authorities. The crusade scale demanded religious support for millions of soldiers and civilians involved in the Reconquest campaigns, yet traditional ecclesiastical structures proved inadequate for supporting such mobile operations across vast distances. The Church needed to develop new approaches to military chaplaincy and religious support that could maintain spiritual welfare for forces operating far from established religious infrastructure. The integration of Primaris Space Marines into existing Imperial military structures created theological questions that the ecclesiarchy struggled to address adequately. These enhanced warriors represented clear improvements over traditional Astartes, yet their creation through technological means rather than purely genetic inheritance raised questions about their relationship to the Emperor's original design. Some theological conservatives questioned whether artificial enhancement of the Emperor's work represented hubris, while progressive clergy argued that Guilliman's improvements demonstrated continued divine inspiration working through the Primarch's scientific knowledge. The plague wars that followed Guilliman's return demonstrated both the continued relevance of religious faith and the limitations of traditional theological responses to supernatural threats. The Death Guard's assault on Ultramar brought Nurgle's corruption into direct contact with one of the Imperium's most stable and well-governed regions, creating a testing ground for competing approaches to combating chaos influence. Religious responses proved essential for maintaining civilian morale and military effectiveness, yet purely spiritual approaches proved insufficient without coordinated military and medical interventions. The siege of Parmenio during the Plague Wars illustrated how religious faith could enhance military effectiveness when properly integrated with tactical doctrine. Imperial Guard regiments that received regular spiritual guidance from military chaplains demonstrated superior resistance to the despair and hopelessness that Nurgle's influence promoted among enemy forces. However, units that relied exclusively on religious protection without appropriate medical precautions suffered devastating casualties from diseases that affected faithful and heretical alike. The campaign's lessons emphasized the need for balanced approaches that combined spiritual and practical responses to supernatural threats. Mortarian's personal confrontation with Guilliman during the Plague Wars created theological implications that extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. The sight of two Primarchs engaged in direct combat provided validation for Imperial beliefs about the ongoing struggle between divine and corrupted forces, Yet the inconclusive nature of their encounters raised questions about the ultimate outcome of humanity's cosmic struggle. Religious interpretations of these events emphasized the Emperor's continued protection of his loyal son, while acknowledging that final victory remained dependent upon sustained human effort rather than inevitable divine intervention. The psychic awakening that swept across the galaxy during the era Adeptus created new challenges for ecclesiastical authorities already struggling to address the Great Rift's effects. The sudden manifestation of psychic abilities among previously normal Imperial citizens required theological frameworks that could distinguish between divine gifts and dangerous mutations that might facilitate chaos corruption. Traditional approaches to identifying and managing psykers proved inadequate when entire planetary populations experienced simultaneous psychic manifestations that exceeded existing institutional capacity. The mass emergence of psychic phenomena created practical challenges for local clergy who lacked the specialized training necessary for evaluating supernatural experiences. Parish priests found themselves confronting parishioners who claimed prophetic visions, miraculous healings, or other supernatural experiences that might represent genuine divine intervention or dangerous psychic corruption. The Church's existing procedures for investigating miraculous claims proved inadequate when such events occurred simultaneously across multiple worlds and involved millions of individuals rather than isolated cases. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica's expanded recruitment efforts during the Psychic Awakening required unprecedented cooperation with ecclesiastical authorities who possessed primary contact with local populations. The Church's parish networks provided essential infrastructure for identifying and evaluating potential psykers, yet this collaboration created tensions between religious and secular approaches to managing psychic phenomena. Ecclesiastical authorities emphasized the spiritual dimensions of psychic awakening, while telepathica personnel focused on practical questions of training and control that might conflict with religious sensibilities. The emergence of new saint-like figures during the Psychic Awakening created both opportunities and challenges for the Adeptus Ministerum's canonization processes. Individuals who demonstrated miraculous abilities and inspired widespread devotion appeared throughout Imperial space, yet the unprecedented scale of supernatural phenomena made it difficult to distinguish between genuine divine intervention and psychic manifestations that might lack authentic religious significance. The Church needed to develop new criteria for evaluating potential saints while maintaining the rigorous standards that preserved the integrity of the canonization process. The expansion of Tyranid Hive fleet incursions during the era Indomitus required theological adaptations that could address the unique challenges posed by this alien threat. Unlike chaos corruption or conventional Xenos enemies, the Tyranids represented a form of alien life that seemed to exist purely for consumption and destruction without any comprehensible motivation or negotiable objectives. Traditional Imperial doctrine that emphasized humanity's manifest destiny and eventual victory over alien enemies proved psychologically inadequate when confronted with enemies that appeared capable of consuming entire worlds regardless of human resistance or divine protection. The shadow and the warp phenomenon associated with Tyranid presence created particular theological difficulties as it interfered with traditional forms of religious communication and spiritual comfort. Imperial citizens accustomed to finding solace in prayer and religious observance discovered that Tyranid proximity created a spiritual numbness that made religious experience seem distant and ineffective. Local clergy struggled to maintain congregational faith when traditional religious practices failed to provide their expected psychological and spiritual benefits. Ecclesiastical responses to Tyranid threats emphasized themes of sacrifice and martyrdom that had always characterized Imperial military doctrine, yet these traditional approaches required adaptation to address the unique psychological challenges posed by enemies that consumed their victims completely. Religious instruction needed to provide meaning for deaths that left no remains to honor and no survivors to remember the fallen. The Church developed new liturgies that celebrated the spiritual significance of resistance even when physical victory appeared impossible, emphasizing that faithful sacrifice served divine purposes regardless of immediate tactical outcomes. The increasing frequency of chaos incursions throughout imperial space during the era Indomitus strained existing theological frameworks for understanding and combating spiritual corruption. The Great Rift's ongoing presence created conditions that facilitated demonic manifestation and heretical cult activity on scales that exceeded traditional ecclesiastical responses. Local clergy found themselves confronting forms of chaos corruption that had previously been confined to the most extreme frontier regions, requiring rapid adaptation of pastoral techniques and theological understanding. The Adeptus Ministerum's collaboration with the Ordo Hereticus intensified as both organizations struggled to address the increased prevalence of heretical activity throughout imperial space. Traditional approaches to identifying and eliminating chaos cults proved inadequate when entire planetary populations might be exposed to corrupting influences through environmental factors rather than deliberate heretical indoctrination. The Church needed to develop new approaches to spiritual purification and community healing that could address widespread corruption without destroying the social structures necessary for imperial governance. The evolution of imperial religious practice during the era Indomitus demonstrated both the adaptability that had always characterized the faith and the fundamental stability of its core theological principles. Despite facing challenges that exceeded anything encountered during previous millennia, the Adeptus Ministerum maintained doctrinal unity while developing innovative responses to unprecedented threats. Local adaptations reflected the creativity and dedication of clergy throughout imperial space, yet these innovations remained grounded in the theological foundations that Sebastian Thor had established during his reforms of the Age of Apostasy. The emergence of new religious orders and specialized ecclesiastical organizations during the era Indomitus reflected the Church's institutional response to unprecedented challenges, yet these adaptations served a far greater purpose than mere crisis management. They demonstrated the fundamental truth that had sustained imperial civilization for 10 millennia. Faith in the Emperor provides not merely comfort or meaning, but the essential foundation upon which humanity's survival depends. The Adeptus Ministerum's ability to evolve while maintaining doctrinal consistency reveals the deeper reality that imperial faith represents far more than organized religion. It constitutes the spiritual infrastructure that binds together a million worlds and countless human lives in common purpose and mutual support. The imperial cult's role in maintaining unity across the vast expanse of human space operates through mechanisms that transcend simple administrative coordination or political control. When Imperial Guard regiments from dozens of different worlds coordinate their assault on a heretical stronghold, their ability to function as a unified force depends not merely on standardized equipment and tactical doctrine, but on shared religious beliefs that create instant bonds of trust and mutual understanding. Soldiers who have never met before recognize each other as brothers in faith, united by common prayers, shared rituals, and identical devotion to the Golden Throne. This spiritual unity enables military cooperation on scales that would be impossible through purely secular means, as religious faith provides the emotional and psychological foundation necessary for individuals to sacrifice their lives for strangers who share their beliefs. The economic networks that sustain imperial civilization similarly depend upon religious unity to function across galactic distances and cultural barriers. Merchant captains navigating the treacherous currents of the warp rely not only on their navigators' psychic abilities, but on shared faith that the Emperor's protection will see them safely through the Imperium's dangers. Trade agreements between worlds separated by decades of travel time require levels of trust that can only be sustained through common religious obligations that make contract violations forms of spiritual betrayal. The tithe systems that support imperial military forces and governmental institutions operate through religious duty rather than mere economic necessity, as planetary governors understand their resource obligations as sacred responsibilities rather than bureaucratic requirements. The administrative apparatus that governs imperial space draws its authority from religious legitimacy that transforms routine governmental functions into expressions of divine will. When Adeptus Administratum scribes process taxation records or military recruitment quotas, they perform their duties within religious frameworks that treat accurate record-keeping and efficient resource allocation as forms of worship. This spiritual dimension of administrative work creates motivation and dedication that purely secular bureaucracies cannot match, as imperial servants understand their contributions to governmental efficiency as participation in the Emperor's divine plan for humanity. The result is an administrative system that maintains coherence across impossible distances and time scales through shared religious conviction rather than direct oversight or enforcement. The relationship between faith and the Emperor's psychic presence in the warp represents one of the most profound mysteries of imperial theology, yet its practical effects shape daily life throughout human space. The astronomician that guides imperial vessels through warp travel emanates from the Emperor's location upon the Golden Throne, creating a psychic beacon that transcends purely physical phenomena to become a spiritual lighthouse for all humanity. Navigators who follow the astronomician's guidance experience not merely directional orientation, but spiritual communion with the Emperor's divine presence, as their psychic abilities allow them to perceive the sacred nature of the beacon that guides their ships through the Imperium's chaos. The Emperor's psychic influence extends far beyond navigation assistance to encompass direct intervention in human affairs through mechanisms that orthodox theology struggles to fully explain yet cannot deny. Imperial citizens throughout the galaxy report experiences of divine guidance during moments of crisis, from battlefield commanders who receive tactical insights during desperate battles to ordinary workers who discover solutions to technical problems through apparent divine inspiration. These experiences create personal relationships between individual believers and the Emperor's divine presence that strengthen faith while providing practical benefits that enhance imperial effectiveness in countless small but significant ways. The phenomenon of imperial saints provides the most dramatic evidence of the Emperor's continued psychic activity within the material universe, as these blessed individuals demonstrate abilities that transcend normal human limitations through direct divine intervention. Saint Celestine's repeated resurrections during critical battles represent the most visible manifestations of this divine power, yet countless lesser saints throughout imperial history have demonstrated similar supernatural abilities that validate religious beliefs while providing practical assistance during times of need. The saints serve as conduits through which the Emperor's psychic presence can influence material events, creating a network of divine intervention that operates throughout imperial space to support faithful believers and punish those who threaten humanity's welfare. The Star Child prophecy represents the ultimate expression of theological hope regarding the Emperor's eventual transcendence of his current physical limitations, though this doctrine remains controversial even within ecclesiastical circles. According to this interpretation of imperial eschatology, the Emperor's psychic essence continues to grow stronger through the faith and devotion of his worshippers, gradually accumulating the spiritual energy necessary for complete rebirth as a fully divine being freed from dependence upon the Golden Throne. This prophetic vision suggests that humanity's faithful worship serves not merely as expression of devotion, but as active participation in the Emperor's transformation from wounded protector to triumphant God-King who will lead humanity to ultimate victory over all enemies. The theological implications of the Star Child prophecy extend beyond mere speculation about future events to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of divinity and humanity's role in cosmic affairs. If faithful worship can contribute to the Emperor's spiritual development, then every prayer and religious observance becomes an act of cosmic significance that advances humanity's ultimate destiny. This interpretation provides additional motivation for religious devotion, while suggesting that the Emperor's divine plan includes active participation by his human servants rather than mere passive acceptance of divine protection. The prophecy thus transforms imperial faith from reactive worship into proactive collaboration with divine will. The ongoing struggle against chaos represents the most critical arena where religious devotion proves essential for imperial survival, as purely military responses prove inadequate against enemies who attack through spiritual corruption as much as physical violence. The four chaos gods draw their power from human emotions and desires, making their influence particularly dangerous in a galaxy where billions of humans experience the despair, anger, and other negative emotions that feed demonic entities. Imperial faith provides crucial protection against this spiritual warfare by channeling human emotional energy toward the Emperor rather than allowing it to strengthen chaos powers through unconscious psychic emanation. Religious discipline that emphasizes duty, sacrifice, and service to others creates psychological resistance to the selfish desires and emotional extremes that make individuals vulnerable to chaos corruption. When imperial citizens focus their hopes and fears on the Emperor's divine protection rather than personal gratification or worldly concerns, they deny chaos powers the emotional sustenance that enables demonic manifestation and heretical corruption. This spiritual warfare operates at individual and collective levels, as communities united by common faith create psychic environments that actively resist chaos influence through their shared devotion to orthodox imperial beliefs. The Adeptus sororitas exemplify how religious devotion can be transformed into military effectiveness against supernatural enemies that conventional forces cannot reliably defeat. The sisters' absolute faith provides immunity to many forms of chaos corruption, while enabling them to wield blessed weapons and sacred artifacts that prove devastatingly effective against demonic entities. Their presence on battlefields creates zones of spiritual purity that weaken chaos forces, while strengthening imperial troops through divine protection that manifests as improved morale, enhanced courage, and occasional miraculous intervention that enables victory against impossible odds. The struggle against Xeno's threats requires different applications of religious conviction, as alien enemies typically lack the spiritual corruption that characterizes chaos forces, yet pose equally serious dangers to human survival and imperial stability. Religious doctrine that emphasizes humanity's manifest destiny and special relationship with the Emperor provides psychological preparation for the ruthless warfare necessary to defeat alien species that compete with humans for galactic dominance. Faith-based hatred of alien influences prevents the cultural contamination that might weaken human resolve or create sympathy for enemies who must be destroyed rather than negotiated with or converted to imperial service. The Tyranid threat demonstrates how religious faith can provide meaning and motivation, even when facing enemies that appear capable of consuming all human life regardless of resistance efforts. Traditional military doctrine that promises eventual victory through superior tactics and equipment proves psychologically inadequate when confronting hive fleets that adapt to human countermeasures while possessing virtually unlimited numbers and resources. Religious faith that emphasizes the spiritual significance of resistance regardless of tactical outcomes enables imperial forces to maintain fighting effectiveness even when victory appears impossible, as soldiers understand their sacrifice as service to the Emperor rather than mere military duty. Internal corruption within imperial society represents perhaps the most insidious threat to human survival, as it undermines the unity and cooperation that enable imperial civilization to function across galactic distances. Religious devotion provides essential protection against the greed, ambition, and moral compromise that create opportunities for heretical infiltration and administrative breakdown. When imperial servants understand their duties as sacred obligations rather than mere professional responsibilities, they demonstrate resistance to the temptations that might otherwise lead them to betray their positions for personal advantage or alien influence. The Adeptus Ministerum's role in identifying and combating internal corruption extends beyond formal investigations of heretical activity to encompass the daily pastoral care that strengthens individual moral resistance to temptation. Parish priests who maintain regular contact with their communities can recognize the early signs of spiritual contamination that might eventually develop into serious threats to imperial security. Religious education that emphasizes proper moral behavior and spiritual discipline creates psychological barriers against the gradual moral decay that makes individuals vulnerable to heretical recruitment or alien manipulation. The future of the imperial cult faces challenges that will test every aspect of its theological foundations and institutional structures, yet the faith's historical adaptability suggests that it will continue to evolve while maintaining essential doctrinal consistency. The Great Rift's ongoing presence creates permanent changes in the spiritual environment throughout imperial space, requiring theological innovations that can address new forms of supernatural phenomena while preserving the core beliefs that define imperial identity. The Church's ability to develop appropriate responses to these challenges will determine not merely its own institutional survival, but humanity's continued existence as a unified civilization. The integration of new technologies and military capabilities into imperial society requires theological frameworks that can evaluate innovations for consistency with religious doctrine, while avoiding the technological stagnation that might leave humanity vulnerable to more adaptable enemies. The Primaris Space Marines represent successful integration of improved capabilities with established religious traditions, demonstrating that technological advancement can serve divine purposes when properly guided by faithful leadership. Future developments will require similar balance between innovation and tradition, ensuring that human progress serves the Emperor's divine plan rather than undermining the spiritual foundations that sustain imperial civilization. The expansion of imperial territory through the Indomitus Crusade and similar military campaigns creates opportunities for spreading imperial faith to new populations, while presenting challenges of cultural integration that must be managed carefully to avoid doctrinal fragmentation. Newly compliant worlds bring their own historical experiences and cultural traditions that must be evaluated for compatibility with imperial religious requirements. The Church's success in managing this integration will determine whether imperial expansion strengthens the faith through increased diversity or weakens it through doctrinal confusion and cultural conflict. The ultimate significance of the imperial cult transcends its role as organized religion to encompass its function as the spiritual foundation upon which human survival depends in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. In a galaxy where hostile aliens seek humanity's destruction, chaos powers corrupt human souls for their own malevolent purposes, and internal divisions threaten to tear apart the largest empire in galactic history, faith in the Emperor provides the unity, purpose, and spiritual strength necessary for continued resistance. The imperial cult does not merely offer comfort to believers or meaning to their lives. It provides the essential foundation that enables humanity to maintain civilization across impossible distances while facing enemies that would destroy any lesser species. The Emperor's divine protection, manifested through the Astronomicon, the intervention of saints, and the daily spiritual guidance experienced by faithful believers, represents humanity's greatest strategic advantage in its struggle for galactic survival. This protection operates not through miraculous intervention that eliminates all dangers, but through the spiritual strength that enables human beings to face impossible odds with courage, unity, and determination that their enemies cannot match or understand. The imperial cult transforms ordinary humans into instruments of divine will, creating a civilization that can endure any hardship and overcome any enemy through faith that transcends individual mortality and personal concerns. As humanity faces an uncertain future in which new threats emerge while ancient enemies grow stronger, the imperial cult remains the eternal foundation upon which all hope rests. The Emperor's light shines from the Golden Throne across 10,000 years of darkness, guiding his people through perils that would have destroyed any lesser faith. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Imperial cult provides the one constant truth that sustains human civilization. The Emperor protects, and through faith in his divine will, humanity endures.